The knife needed sharpening again. Lena pulled it from the leather wrap beside her sleeping mat and dragged the blade across the whetstone with slow, even strokes. Outside the cabin, the forest breathed. Wind moved through the pine canopy above and sent a soft, low moan down through the gaps in the wooden walls. She did not look up. She had learned a long time ago that sounds in the forest were rarely threats. Mostly they were just the forest reminding her it was still there, as if she could forget. The cabin was not much. 4 walls of stacked pine logs sealed with river clay, a floor of packed earth covered with old furs, a stone hearth where she kept a low fire through the cold months. A single window, no glass, just a shutter she could bar from the inside. A wooden shelf along one wall where she kept her dried herbs and her tools, and the small collection of things that had survived 6 years of a stripped-down life. She had built it herself in the first autumn after she left, back when her hands still shook and her sleep was full of noise. She had not had nightmares in 2 years now. She had not decided if that was healing or just forgetting, and she had stopped spending much time trying to figure out the difference. She turned the knife and pulled it across the stone again. The sound was quiet and even and familiar. She found it calming the way other people found music calming, the rhythm of it, the proof that something useful was being done with her hands. Dawn was still an hour away. She could tell by the quality of the darkness outside, the way there was a softness to it now, a loosening at the edges where before it had been fully sealed. She would be up and moving before the light broke over the ridge. She liked the hour before dawn. Nothing in the forest expected her then. Nothing was watching. That was the closest she came, these days, to feeling safe. Her name was Lena. Only Lena now. She had shed the rest of it the way a wolf sheds its winter coat, not all at once and not cleanly, but steadily until one day she looked and the rest of it was just gone. For 6 years she had lived in the deep woods on the eastern edge of the territory that the pack maps marked as unclaimed, the blank space between the recognized borders where the trees were old enough that the light barely reached the ground even in midsummer. The undergrowth was dense. The paths were made by deer and boar and the slow, patient movement of water finding lower ground. There were no human trails here because there were no humans here. That was the whole point. She did not use fire during the day. She kept her food stores underground, covered with flat stones and packed earth, the way the old woodsmen did before there were markets and roads. She tracked her own movement through the forest so that she never made a pattern, never walked the same path twice in the same week. She rotated her snare lines and varied the hours of her hunting, and never left visible marks on any tree or stone that would tell a trained tracker anything useful about the person who had made them. She had lived long enough around skilled trackers to understand that patterns were what got people found. She did not want to be found. She set the knife down on the furs beside her and looked at the fire. It had burned low while she worked, nothing now but a small orange pulse in the dark. She did not feed it. In an hour she would be outside, and she never left a fire burning when she was not there to watch it. She had learned that discipline in the first month, before the life here had fully settled into the bones of her daily routine. There was no one to teach her. She had simply learned what the forest punished and what it did not. 6 years. Sometimes the number surprised her. She would be doing something ordinary, setting a snare or patching a place in the roof where a branch had fallen in a storm, and the thought would arrive without warning. 6 years. She would stand still for a moment with the weight of it, all that quiet time stretched out behind her, and then she would go back to whatever she was doing because there was always something to do, and doing things was how she kept the quiet from becoming something worse than quiet. She had been 23 when she left. She was 29 now, though she did not mark the days or celebrate the turning of years. She knew her approximate age the same way she knew the approximate temperature and the approximate time, by reading the evidence around her and drawing reasonable conclusions from it. She stood, rolled her sleeping mat and tied it against the wall. Then she pulled on her boots, heavy leather worn to the shape of her feet after years of daily use, and took her coat from the hook beside the door. It was a long coat, dark brown, made from the hide of a deer she had taken in her 3rd winter here. She had cured the leather herself over several weeks, an imperfect process that resulted in something stiff in places and buttersoft in others, but it kept the wind out better than anything she had owned before this life, and it did not look like anything a person from a pack settlement would wear, which had been, in those first years especially, a consideration. She opened the door. The cold hit her face and she breathed it in deeply. It smelled of pine resin and wet earth, and somewhere far above the cloud line, the particular clean sharpness that meant snow. Winter was coming in early this year. She had been reading that in the behavior of the animals for the past 2 weeks, the deer moving lower than usual, the squirrels frantic and relentless in their caching, the birds gone 2 weeks ahead of where they should have been by her internal calendar. She had already put up enough food to carry her through a hard winter, more than enough, because she had learned in the second year what happened when she misjudged and came up short in the deep cold months. She did not repeat mistakes. The forest did not give you many chances. She moved out of the clearing and into the trees without looking back at the cabin. The forest accepted her the way it always did, without ceremony. She had learned to move inside it, to read it, to understand its rhythms in the way she had once understood the rhythms of pack life. In some ways they were not entirely different. A forest had a structure. Everything in it had its role and its relationship to everything else. The trees and the light and the water and the animals all communicated constantly in a language that was not spoken and did not require translation, only attention. She had spent 6 years paying attention, and she had become fluent. She followed the ridge east, moving through the dark with the ease of long practice. She did not carry a light. A light was a signal. A light said, "Here I am." She had spent 6 years saying the opposite of that, and she was very good at it now. The snare line was set along the base of the ridge, where the rabbits moved down from the upper scrub to graze before dawn. She had placed 7 snares the previous evening, set them in the particular patient way she had developed over years of trial and understanding, the angles and the heights and the specific placement that accounted for the behavior of individual animals in this particular section of terrain. 2 rabbits and a large hare. Good. She dispatched them quickly and efficiently the way she did everything, and cleaned them where she stood, leaving the offal for the foxes. Nothing went to waste in the forest. She had learned that from the forest itself, the way it composted everything back into itself, the way nothing here was ever truly discarded but only changed into something else. She was resetting the last snare when she saw it. She almost missed it. It was on the eastern face of a stone birch, the kind of pale-barked tree she usually gave a wide berth because the bark caught light in ways she disliked. But something made her look, some small irregularity at the edge of her vision, some deviation in the texture she had stared at so many thousands of times that anything different registered immediately. She moved closer. It was a cut, not a natural mark. She knew every natural mark on every major tree in a 2-mile radius around her cabin because she had examined all of them deliberately in her first years here, cataloging what was ordinary so she would know immediately what was not. This cut was fresh. The exposed wood beneath the removed bark was still pale and damp, not yet oxidized to the gray-brown that came with exposure. Someone had made this mark within the last day, possibly within the last several hours. She stood very still and looked at it. It was a pack marking. She had not needed to read one in 6 years, and she had told herself on more than one quiet evening that she had forgotten what they looked like. She had not forgotten. She recognized the pattern before her mind had even finished processing what her eyes were taking in, the way you recognize a sound from your childhood before you can name what it is. 2 parallel cuts crossed with a diagonal slash, below them a curved mark that she knew to mean territory used for transit, not settlement, not a territorial boundary, transit, passage, someone moving through. Her hand tightened around the rabbits. She made herself breathe slowly, in through the nose, hold out. Transit markings meant scouts. Scouts meant a larger group moving somewhere, or a search party cataloging territory, or an advance party preparing for something larger. All of those things meant more wolves than the single marker. And the marker was fresh, which meant whoever had made it was likely still somewhere within this stretch of forest. She looked around slowly without moving her head, just her eyes working through the spaces between the trees in the systematic order she had developed for exactly this kind of situation. Nothing moved. The darkness was beginning to lift now, the sky shifting from sealed black to the deep blue of very early morning, and she could see further than she could an hour ago. Nothing that did not belong, no shape that was wrong, no shadow that was inconsistent with the trees that cast it. She looked back at the mark. 2 parallel cuts, a diagonal slash, the curve below. She had seen marks like this before. She had made marks like this before years ago, when she was a different person moving through forests on different business. But the specific pattern, the way the diagonal connected to the curve at the particular angle she was looking at, the depth and the spacing, she had seen that style in only one context. The Ironwood Pack. Her stomach dropped. The Ironwood Pack was the largest and most powerful of the eastern packs, its territory covering more ground than any 3 others combined, its alpha known across every territory as a man whose reach extended as far as he chose to extend it. The Ironwood Pack had resources and skilled people. and a history of not needing to explain itself to anyone, because no one with any practical sense pressed the Ironwood pack to explain itself. She turned and walked back toward the cabin, not running. She did not run. Running in the forest made noise and left unmistakable sign, and both of those things were information she was not going to give away freely. She walked quickly and steadily, and she let her mind work while her feet moved. The Ironwood pack had no straightforward reason to be in this section of forest. There was nothing here that any pack would want, no resources in dispute, no settlement to anchor a transit route, no territorial overlap worth sending scouts through. The only thing in this particular stretch of deep woods was her, and she had been meticulous about making sure no one knew that. She had apparently not been meticulous enough. Back in the cabin, she hung the cleaned rabbits from the ceiling hook and fed the fire enough to bring it up to cooking temperature, and sat down on the edge of her sleeping mat with the knife in her hand and thought. The practical part of her mind, the part that had kept her alive and hidden for 6 years, ran through the options with calm efficiency. She could move. She had done it once before in the second year when a group of hikers had come too close to her established range, and she had packed everything that mattered into her carry pack in under half an hour and walked 15 miles north by morning, relocating to a site she had already identified as a backup. She could do that again. She had identified 3 potential backup locations over the years, all at varying distances and in different directions, all already scouted and assessed. She could be out of this territory before the scouts completed another circuit. Or she could stay. A single transit marking on a single tree did not mean she was the reason for the transit. It did not mean she had been found. It did not mean anything specific at all, except that trained Ironwood scouts had moved through a section of forest that she happened to occupy. Scouts moved through all kinds of wilderness all the time for all kinds of reasons. The mark was information, not certainty. She looked at her hands. They were steady. She noticed that and filed it away as something worth noting. A year ago, maybe even 6 months ago, a discovery like this would have sent a fine tremor through her fingers that she would have needed several minutes to bring back under control. The steadiness now was either progress or the particular flatness that comes from spending too many years alone with your own fear until it loses its sharpest edges. She had not decided which. She picked up the knife and began to work the edge again. The motion was familiar and the sound was familiar, and both of them helped, in the way that familiar things always helped when the world became uncertain. Outside, the forest was beginning its morning process, birds moving in the upper canopy, small animals rustling through the undergrowth as they always did at this hour, the ordinary sounds of a living place going about its business. She listened to the ordinary sounds, and beneath them she listened for what was not ordinary, and for now there was nothing, just the usual texture of the forest morning, and she let that register as the information it was. Right now, in this moment, she was not being approached. Whatever was out there was not, right now, coming for her. Right now. She worked the knife and watched the fire and thought about the Ironwood pack, and for the first time in 6 years, she let herself think about the name she had been not thinking for a very long time. The Ironwood Alpha. She stopped herself before the name fully formed. Not yet. She was not going to go to that particular piece of information until she had more context. Names were like doors, and some doors you did not open without knowing what was on the other side, and she had sealed this one so carefully for so many years that opening it needed to be deliberate, not a reflex. She finished with the knife and tested the edge and set it down and looked at the ceiling. The rabbits needed to come down and go in the pot. She should eat before she did anything else. She always thought more clearly on a full stomach, and right now she needed to think very clearly about what she was going to do next. She stood up and got to work. Outside, the forest held its morning quiet. She listened to it while she cooked, the particular frequency of it, the way it felt today against the way it had felt yesterday and all the days before that. Something was different, not dramatically, not obviously, but in the way that a room feels different when someone has been in it while you were gone, not from anything you can point to specifically, but from the cumulative effect of small disturbances too minor to identify individually. She ate slowly and thought carefully. She had until the scouts were gone, or until she understood what they were doing here to make a decision. Until then she would watch, she would track what was trackable, she would stay quiet and small and careful. She was very good at quiet, she was very good at small. She finished eating and cleaned the pot and put it back on the shelf and looked at the door. Then she looked at the knife. Then she looked at the pack hanging on the hook by the door, the one she could fill in 15 minutes if she needed to. Then she looked at the door again. She went to the window and lifted the shutter just enough to look out. The forest looked exactly as it always did, trees and shadow and the slow advance of morning light through the canopy. Ordinary. The kind of ordinary that was either genuine or very carefully arranged, and 6 years of practice had not yet taught her how to tell the difference with certainty. She let the shutter down. She was not going to run, not yet, not without more information. Running without information was panic, and panic was the most expensive thing in this forest, more expensive than hunger, more expensive than cold, more expensive than anything else she had ever had to pay for here. She was going to pay attention instead. That was what she did, that was what she was good at. She had built an entire life out of paying attention, and it had kept her here, alive and undiscovered, for 6 years. She was going to trust it to keep her a little longer. She went back to the mat and sat down and pulled her knees up and leaned against the wall and thought about what the morning would bring. The fire burned low, she did not feed it, the rabbits were cleaned and hung, the pot was back on the shelf, the knife was within arm's reach. Outside, the forest breathed. And somewhere in the forest, something that should not have been there was moving through the dark between the trees, leaving marks on pale birch bark, getting close enough to her careful, quiet life that she could feel the disturbance in the air without yet being able to see the source of it. She sat in the low light and breathed and waited. She had always been very good at waiting. By mid-morning, Lena had confirmed one thing: there were at least 3 of them. She had not seen them directly. She had built her confirmation from smaller evidence, the kind of evidence that most people would walk past without registering, because they had not spent 6 years training themselves to see what the forest was actually saying rather than what they expected to see. A broken branch at exactly the height and angle of a shoulder brushing past it. A scuff in the soft earth near the creek where a boot had shifted for balance. A disturbance in a spider's web stretched between 2 low branches, not torn but displaced, as if the air around it had moved in a directed and intentional way rather than in the random drift of wind. 3 sets of disturbances. 3 slightly different profiles of weight and movement and attention, moving on 3 separate lines through the eastern section of her territory, spread wide enough to cover ground but close enough to maintain contact. Her territory. She had started thinking of it that way sometime in the 2nd year and had never corrected herself. The forest did not own itself in any way that a pack charter would recognize, but she had come to know it more intimately than any official claim could account for. And that knowledge felt like a kind of ownership that mattered even if it had no legal standing anywhere. She tracked them from above. The technique had taken her the better part of her first summer to develop, after she realized that ground movement was traceable in ways that canopy movement was not. The trees in this section were old growth, massive and close together, their upper branches interlocking in a way that allowed a person who was light and had spent years building the necessary balance and strength to travel for stretches without touching the ground. She was light. She had spent years building the strength and the balance. The technique was not fast and it was not comfortable, and it required a quality of attention that was exhausting over long periods, but it had saved her twice in 6 years, and she had never stopped practicing it. She found a good position in a wide oak 40 feet up, settled into the junction of 2 heavy branches with her back against the trunk, and waited. They came into her sightline 20 minutes after she took her position, moving through the trees below with the confidence of people who did not believe they were being observed. She looked at them with the particular focused attention she had developed here, the kind that did not rush and did not assume, that gathered information in layers and withheld judgment until several layers had accumulated. 3 figures, the formation they were using was not a standard patrol pattern, too loose and too relaxed for that. They moved with the ease of people who were not worried about what might be watching them, which told her something about how they had assessed this section of territory before entering it. They had decided it was empty. That was a useful thing to know. The one on the left was the youngest of the 3, she thought, not by much but by the way he moved, a slight excess of energy in his footwork, the keenness of someone who had not yet translated training into the deeper, more conserved efficiency that came with years of experience. He checked the canopy above him every 30 seconds with the regularity of something trained into him rather than chosen. She appreciated the habit even as she was grateful, watching him, that he did not look at quite the right angle to find her. The one in the middle was the leader. She could tell not from any insignia she could make out at this distance, but from the way the other two organized themselves around him, the subtle orientation of their bodies toward his even when they were spread apart, the way decisions seemed to originate with him and travel outward rather than arising from any of the other three. He moved with the calm of command, the particular unhurriedness of someone who knew that the pace was his to set. The one on the right was the most experienced of the three, moving with the low, careful economy of someone who had spent years learning how to carry themselves in a forest without announcing their presence in any of the thousand small ways that untrained people announce themselves constantly. She watched this one the most carefully because this one was the one most likely to notice something wrong, if there was something wrong to notice. Pack Scouts, Ironwood, by the equipment she could make out on the leader at this distance. There was a metal buckle at his belt with a pattern she could not see clearly but could read by its shape from 40 feet, the way you read a word you know so well that you need only the first letters, the Ironwood insignia. She had carried that insignia herself once, not on a belt buckle, but in other ways that a person who spent enough time in pack territory would recognize. She breathed slowly through her nose and watched them pass below her. They were not moving toward the cabin. That was the most important thing she observed in the first hour of watching, and she watched for it carefully, tracking the direction of their movement against her mental map of the territory, noting where their current heading would take them if extended. They were moving parallel to her established range, east to west, on a line that would carry them across the northern edge of it without bringing them within half a mile of the cabin itself. Not searching, moving through. There was a meaningful difference between those two things, and she allowed herself to register it as a small comfort without allowing it to become a false one. She watched for another hour. She watched the way they communicated with each other, brief and efficient, the shorthand of people who had worked together long enough to have developed a shared language of gesture and posture. She watched the leader consult a paper he kept inside his coat, checking it against the terrain, making marks on it occasionally. She watched the experienced one on the right pause at intervals and turn slowly to look behind them, the check of someone covering the group's rear exposure. She watched the young one on the left stop once to examine a piece of sign on the ground, crouch over it, stand again, and report to the leader in that same shorthand. They found nothing worth stopping for, they kept moving. When they passed out of her direct sight lane, she did not climb down. She moved through the canopy on her aerial route, following their general direction, staying well above and well back, maintaining the kind of distance that made observation possible without making detection likely. She lost them twice and found them again both times, reading their trail in the disturbance of the undergrowth below her rather than by seeing them directly. She followed them for another 2 hours. In those 2 hours they made no move toward the interior of her range. They continued on their transit line, methodical and unhurried, stopping twice to examine the terrain in detail and once to share food in a brief rest. They did not find any of her sign. She noted each moment when they passed within range of one of her trails and registered without reaction that they did not detect it. She had been careful, 6 years of careful. Late in the morning, she let them go. She dropped from the lower branches of the last tree she had used, landing in the soft earth below, and crouched there for a moment with her hand on the ground, listening. Nothing close. The scouts were moving away from her now, their presence diminishing in the particular way that a disturbance in water diminishes when the thing that caused it moves away. She straightened and walked back toward the cabin, taking a route that curved north and then west before turning south, adding extra distance to stay clear of any trail the scouts might have made in the outer edge of her range. She was a 1/4 mile from the cabin when she heard the scout stop. She froze on instinct, the full-body stillness that was pure reflex by now, her breathing reduced to the minimum and her attention narrowed to the single point of awareness. The sound of a boot pausing on dry leaves, approximately 30 feet to her right, just inside the tree line. She was in the shadow of a stand of young birch, close enough to the ground that her silhouette would be broken by the undergrowth, wearing clothes that were the color of winter forest, standing still in the way that stillness had a quality to it, a completeness that simple motionlessness did not. She had learned that distinction. There was stopping and there was stillness, and they were not the same. A long pause, she counted it, 20 seconds, 25, 30. The scout's boot shifted. A small adjustment of weight, a reconsideration, or simply the instinct of a trained person who had felt something without being able to name it, and had paused to let the feeling develop into information. It did not develop. The boot moved again, continuing its original direction west away from her, and the dry leaves registered the departure, and then the sound faded and she stood in the birch stand until she had counted 2 full minutes of silence. Then she continued to the cabin. Inside, she sat down on the sleeping mat and looked at the wall opposite, and let herself process what she had seen and what she had heard, and what it added up to. 3 scouts, Ironwood, in transit, not searching. They had not found her, that was true, that was real. But they were here in her forest. And the Ironwood pack did not move scouts through empty territory without reason, and she had been telling herself for 6 years that she was in empty territory, that she had chosen a space that no one would think to look at, and the presence of 3 Ironwood scouts in her tree line was a very direct piece of evidence that she had been, in some important way, wrong about that. She pulled her knees up and pressed her back against the wall and thought. The transit route. If the scouts were establishing a transit route, they would be back. Routes were not established in a single pass. They were walked, assessed, walked again, compared to alternatives, and finalized after multiple passes confirmed they were viable. If these 3 were the first pass, there would be a second, and a third, and eventually the route would be in use regularly, which meant regular scout presence in this section of forest, which meant her probability of being detected went from extremely low to something she could no longer simply dismiss. She needed to understand what the route was for. A transit route was established to serve a movement, and the nature of the movement told you what was coming. Scouts moving supplies took one kind of route. Scouts moving people took another. Scouts establishing advance access for a significant figure took a third, and that third kind of route had the most specific and identifiable characteristics of all 3. She had spent an hour watching them this morning, and she was now fairly certain, in the way she was certain about things she had not yet proven but had strong grounds for believing, that what these scouts were establishing was the third kind of route. Advance access. For someone significant enough that 3 of the Ironwood pack's best scouts were out here in the deep woods, weeks before any normal transit season, mapping a path through territory that had no obvious strategic value. She sat with that assessment for a long time. Then she heard the leader's voice again in her memory, the words she had heard from 40 feet up in the oak tree when she thought she had been too far away to make them out clearly. She had heard them. She had registered them at the time without processing them fully because she had been focused on not being detected. But the words were there, stored in the precise way her mind stored things it had decided were significant without yet consulting her about that decision. He had leaned close to the scout on his right and said it in the lowered voice of someone who was being professionally cautious, not personally secretive. The Alpha King himself is coming. He is looking for someone. The Alpha King himself. She pressed her palms flat against the floor and felt the coolness of the packed earth beneath them. The Alpha King of the Ironwood pack. The person who held authority over 6 packs and several hundred miles of territory, and who, by all the accounts she had heard in the years before she stopped listening to accounts, had never once in the history of his leadership personally entered unclaimed wilderness territory on a scouting advance, who had never needed to, because the Ironwood pack's reach was extensive enough, and its personnel skilled enough that there was no task requiring the Alpha King's personal presence in the field. Except, apparently, this one. She was very still for a long time. Then she got up and went to the fire and stirred the coals and put more wood on, and stood there watching the flames catch. He is looking for someone. She would not let herself say what she knew. She would not let herself form the specific thought because the specific thought was too heavy, and she needed her mind clear right now, needed it working on practicalities and logistics and the immediate realities of her situation, not on the weight of what that sentence meant if she let it mean what she suspected it meant. She would think about the practical things. She went to the shelf and looked at her supplies. Enough for 3 months of hard winter if she did not supplement them, which she always did, which meant she could stretch them further. The backup pack by the door held enough for a week of fast travel. She knew 3 alternate locations in the forest, each within a day's walk, each already assessed for viability. She could move by dawn tomorrow and be well clear of this territory before the scouts returned for their second pass. She looked at the cabin walls. 4 years of incremental improvement, small modifications to the structure that had made it more weatherproof and more comfortable and more her own. She had built this place. It was the most permanent thing she had made in 6 years, and she had made it out of nothing, out of the forest in her own hands and the accumulating knowledge of what worked and what did not. She could leave it, she had left things that mattered before, she knew how to do that. She went to the window and lifted the shutter and looked at the forest. The afternoon light was coming in low now, changing the quality of the shadows, the gold light of a winter afternoon that cut sideways through the trees and caught the dust in the air, and made the forest look briefly like something in a painting, too beautiful to be practical. She had spent 6 years in a place of practical beauty, and she had been grateful for it sincerely, in the way that a person who has built something necessary and functional is grateful when it turns out to also be beautiful, because that is an extra thing, a thing beyond the minimum that the situation required. She breathed in the cold air from outside. She had until tomorrow to decide. She let the shutter down. Tomorrow she would know more. Tonight she would check the snare line again, prepare a proper meal, bank the fire for a cold night, and think carefully about all the things that were available to her and all the things that were not. She was not going to make this decision out of fear. She had learned, through a great deal of practice, that decisions made out of fear were more expensive than the fears themselves. She was going to make it out of the clear-eyed assessment of available information when she had gathered enough of it. That was what she did. She pulled on her coat and went out to check the eastern snare line before the light failed. The forest was quiet around her, the held quality of it that she was now familiar with, the quality that meant it was paying attention to something she had not yet located. She moved through it with the ease of long practice and told herself the feeling was just residue, the nervous system processing the morning's discoveries. She told herself that, and she almost believed it. Above the tree line, the last light was fading to gray, and somewhere in that gray, something was moving through the forest that had not been there yesterday, and she could feel it the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm, in the body before the mind. She checked the snares. 3 rabbits, good. She cleaned them at the creek and walked back to the cabin with her hands busy and her mind working and the forest watching quietly all around her, keeping whatever it was keeping to itself for now, holding its cold breath in the trees. She barred the door from the inside. She was not afraid. She told herself that clearly, as she did every time it needed to be said. She was not afraid. She lit the fire and got to work. She did not sleep well that night, and by the time the gray edge of morning began to show around the shutter, she had made the decision she had been trying not to make for 3 days. She was staying. Not because she was certain, she was not certain about anything, not because she had a clear plan, she was still assembling the pieces of one. She was staying because leaving now, in the compressed and reactive way that fear was pushing her toward, felt wrong in the way that decisions made under pressure always felt wrong. A forced fit, edges not quite aligned, the kind of thing that got a person into new trouble while they were trying to outrun the old kind. She was staying, at least until she knew more. She went through the morning routine with extra care, covering each step the way she did when she expected the day to be difficult. She ate a real breakfast, enough food to sustain focused activity for several hours. She inspected her equipment and made 2 small repairs that she had been meaning to attend to for a week. She checked the door bar and the window shutter and the back gap in the wall and all of her small signal markers in the clearing, the arrangements of stone and stick that told her at a glance whether anything had passed through the night. Nothing had. She was still undiscovered as far as the evidence indicated. She went out through the back gap and into the trees. The forest was different this morning in ways she was still trying to catalog, not noisier or quieter than usual. The birds were present, the small animals were moving, the usual sounds were mostly where they should be. But there was an undertone to all of it, a tension in the ordinary, the way a piece of music can sound completely familiar right up, until you realize someone has changed the key and everything you thought you knew is now in a slightly different place than where you expected to find it. She moved north first, then east, taking the long route around the perimeter of her range before turning south toward the base of the ridge where the scouts had moved through the previous day. She was not planning to intercept them. She was planning to read the evidence of where they had been and determine what it told her about where they were going. She found their overnight camp in less than 20 minutes. They had built it in a hollow at the base of the ridge, a good choice of position sheltered from the wind on 3 sides by the terrain, the fire built inside the hollow so that its light would not show above the rim. Careful and professional, She crouched at the edge of the hollow and read the camp the way she would read a page of text, the arrangement of bedrolls still visible in the compressed grass, the fire site with its careful construction, the pattern of movement around the camp that she could map from the ground disturbance. 3 people, they had eaten together near the fire, which meant a degree of comfort with one another, not just colleagues but people with established ease. They had slept in a spread pattern with the leader between the other 2, which was how you positioned the person you were responsible for protecting if you were a trained escort rather than an ordinary scout team. She stood up. Escort formation. Not a scouting advance for a transit route, an advance party preparing the way for a significant person. The distinction was important because advance escort parties operated to a schedule, they had a timeline they were working toward, and that timeline was determined by the arrival of whoever they were escorting. Which meant the person they were preparing for was already moving. She stood at the edge of the hollow, with the morning light finding the trees above her, and she let herself form the specific thought she had been refusing to form since the previous day. He was coming here, not generally, not in the direction of this territory among other territories. Here, specifically here. The Alpha King of the Ironwood Pack was en route to this section of deep wilderness, to a stretch of forest that contained nothing of strategic or political value except one thing. The thought arrived with the flatness of things you already know and have been pretending not to know, the particular lack of surprise that comes from the body having processed something before the mind was ready to receive it. She turned and walked back toward the cabin, not quickly, not slowly, at the pace of a person who is giving themselves time to think. He is looking for someone. She had spent 6 years making herself very difficult to find. She had been careful in ways that she had never shared with anyone because there was no one to share them with, careful in ways that had felt, some mornings, like a kind of obsession, like a person who keeps checking the lock on the door not because they truly believe the door will open, but because the checking itself has become the thing that keeps the fear at a manageable level. She had been so careful. And the Ironwood Alpha King was coming to the forest she lived in, with an advance escort of 3 skilled scouts, looking for someone. She reached the cabin and went inside and barred the door and sat down. She sat very still and she thought about what she was going to do, and she came up with several answers and discarded all of them in rapid succession, and arrived at the one that remained when everything impractical had been stripped away. She was going to go to the ridge above where the scouts had come from, and she was going to be there when he arrived, and she was going to see him before he saw her, and then she was going to decide. That was all she had, a decision held open to the last possible moment. She had been doing that for 6 years, holding decisions open, keeping options available. Never quite committing to the final closed version of any choice, because the final closed version meant you could not reverse it. She wondered, sitting in the dim cabin, whether 6 years of open decisions had kept her alive, or just kept her suspended between alive and something else. She got up. She needed to be on the ridge before the light changed. She went out and climbed. The ridge was steep on the western face, the kind of terrain that demanded attention and gave you no room for distraction, and she was grateful for that today, for the necessity of placing each foot with care, and using her hands on the rock and focusing on the immediate physical problem rather than on the larger, more diffuse problem waiting for her at the top. She climbed in the particular way she had learned here, reading the stone, reading the slope, finding the route that looked harder but was actually more stable, the route that a person who did not know this ridge would miss, and a person who had climbed it many times would take without thinking. She reached the top as the afternoon light was beginning its westward lean. From the top of the ridge she could see a long way in the clear winter air. South and east, the forest rolled away in waves of dark pine and bare-branched hardwood, the canopy broken here and there by the pale lines of frozen waterways, by the gray stone faces of exposed rock, by the narrow blue gaps of sky between the trees. She had sat up here many times in 6 years and looked at this view and felt something that was close to peace, not quite peace, more like the temporary suspension of everything that was not this moment, this view, this very specific piece of cold air. She sat down on a flat rock at the highest point of the ridge and watched the forest below her. An hour passed. Then 2. The light changed from afternoon gold to the flat gray of early winter evening, and she was about to stand up and begin the descent when the forest below the ridge changed. Not a sound, not a movement she could point to. Just the particular quality of the change she had felt the previous evening, the shift in the frequency of the ordinary, and this time it was more pronounced, more specific. And she knew with the certainty of someone who had been listening to the forest long enough to trust her own hearing that this was different from the scouts. The scouts had been a disruption. A small one, 3 trained people moving carefully but still a disruption. This was something else. This was the forest adjusting itself around a presence that it recognized as significant in the way that all living things recognize a certain quality of authority, not with submission exactly, but with attention. She saw him when he was still 300 yards from the base of the ridge. A single figure moving through old-growth pine in the early evening light, unhurried, not attempting concealment, simply walking through the forest the way someone walks through their own house. He was too far away and the light was too low for her to read his face. But she did not need to read his face. She had known who it was before she saw him, and seeing him only confirmed a thing she had already been holding. He was tall. He moved the way she remembered, with that particular economy of motion that came from someone who had never needed to make himself look capable, because the capability was too evident to require demonstration. He walked through the forest, and the forest moved around him with the same quality of adjustment she had felt from the ridge, and she watched him walk, and she felt the terrible, inconvenient familiarity of him like a sound from very far away, too faint to identify but impossible to mistake. Caius. She did not say it aloud. She had not said it aloud in 6 years, but it formed in her mind with the completeness of something that had never actually gone away, only been placed somewhere she did not look. He reached the base of the ridge. He stopped. He stood in the small clearing below the ridge, and he looked around him with the unhurried attention of someone assessing terrain, and the space of that clearing and the specific gravity of this moment pressed down on her from above, and she knew she should move, should withdraw, should make the choice right now to be gone before he looked up. She did not move. He lifted his head. His eyes moved up the slope of the ridge, working through the trees methodically, not pausing, not lingering, a professional sweep. They moved across the section of ridge where she was sitting with the particular non-hesitation of someone who is looking but has not yet found. Then he stopped, not looking at her. She was in shadow and she had not moved, and there was no way to see her from 300 feet below at this light. But he stopped, and he stood very still, and after a moment he reached up and pushed the hood of his coat back from his face. He did not look at the ridge. He looked at the trees around him, at the clearing, at the air itself, in the way of someone listening to something too quiet for the ears. Then he said, into the empty air of the clearing, in a voice that carried perfectly in the cold, still evening, "I can hear your heartbeat from here." She did not breathe. "I am not here to force anything," he said. His voice was exactly as she remembered it. That was the first and most disorienting thing, the way 6 years dissolved in the sound of it. "I am not here to argue, and I am not here to take anything from you. I will make camp below the ridge tonight. If you want to leave before morning, I will not follow you." A pause. The evening was completely still. "But I think you should know," he said, "that I have been looking for you for 4 years, and I will still be here in the morning if you decide you want to talk." He turned away from the ridge. He began to move, unhurried, deliberate, selecting a position at the base of the ridge and beginning, with the same calm efficiency she had recognized from 40 feet above him when he was still just a shape in the trees, to make camp. She watched him. She watched him build a fire with the specific technique she had once seen him use in a different forest, the way he banked it from the start for a long burn rather than building it up quickly and letting it die, the economy of a person who thought about what would be needed in 3 hours rather than in the next 10 minutes. She watched him arrange his camp with the neatness that was not fastidiousness, but just the practical understanding that a well-ordered camp was faster to break down and less likely to produce the small accidents that accumulated into larger problems overnight. She watched him and she felt, along with everything else she was feeling, the specific ache of recognition, the way a thing is more painful when it is familiar, when it costs you something to look at it. She turned and walked back down the far side of the ridge. She did not run even then. She walked and she breathed, and she put one foot in front of the other on the steep descent, and she did not let herself think until she was back in the cabin with the door barred behind her. Then she let herself think. And what she thought was not a decision about what to do next. It was not an assessment of the situation or a plan for the morning. What she thought was much simpler and much harder than any of that. She thought, his voice is the same. She thought 4 years, not 6, 4. She thought he said he would not follow. And she thought last, with the particular accuracy of someone who has spent 6 years learning to be honest with herself, in the absence of anyone else to be honest with, I am not going to leave before morning. She had known that before she sat down. She sat in the cabin with the fire burning and the knife on the sleeping mat beside her, and outside, below the ridge, a small fire burned through the night, steady and patient, and she listened to it in the way you listen to a sound you had forgotten you missed. She sat up until well past midnight, and then finally she lay down. She did not sleep until nearly dawn. When she did not dream. She woke when the light was still gray and thin, the hour before dawn that had been her hour for 6 years, the time when the forest was not quite dark and not quite light, and the world had a quality of suspension to it, of being held between two states that she had always found easier to inhabit than the sharper certainties of full day. She lay on her mat and looked at the ceiling and let herself register what the morning actually contained rather than what she wished it contained or feared it contained. He was here. That was the fact, stripped of everything else. He was below the ridge, and he had said he would still be there in the morning, and now it was morning. She got up. She did not reach for the pack by the door. That was itself a decision, the absence of the action, and she registered it without dwelling on it. She put water on the fire for tea, and she dressed, and she stood at the window with the shutter cracked open, and she looked at the line of trees between the cabin and the ridge. The morning was still and cold, and nothing moved in it yet. She drank the tea standing up. Then she put on her coat and went out. Not toward the ridge, not away from it either. She went along the creek north, the way she went when she needed to think and needed to be moving while she thought, because thinking while still had never worked as well for her as thinking while walking. She went to the flat rock above the creek that she used when the cabin felt too enclosed, and she sat on the rock with the cold air on her face and the water moving below her, and she tried to think clearly. He had said, I have been looking for you for 4 years. Not 6, 4. The distinction sat in her chest like a small stone, neither comfortable nor removable. She did not know what to do with it yet, so she set it aside and thought about the things she did know. She knew he was here. She knew he had scouts who had established an approach to this location. She knew he had said he would not force anything. She knew he had said he would not follow her if she chose to leave before morning. She had not chosen to leave. She sat on the rock for a long time, watching the water. The creek moved with the particular determination of water in winter, not as fast as it ran in spring, not as slow as it would run when it began to ice over at the edges, but steady, committed to the direction it had chosen. She had always found something clarifying about watching water. It never debated. It just went where it was going. She thought about the fact that she was still here. She thought about what it meant that she was still here. She thought about the version of herself that had walked out of her old life 6 years ago with a bag and a knife, and the specific flat determination of someone who has decided they are done, completely and finally done, and this new version of herself who was sitting on a rock by a creek 40 feet from the edge of her forest, while chaos of the Ironwood pack camped below the ridge. The two versions were not entirely continuous. 6 years had happened to the person she had been. She was not sure if that meant she was different in ways that mattered or just in ways that were visible. She got up. She walked back toward the cabin, and then, without having made a conscious decision, without having gone through the internal process of weighing and assessing that she usually ran before taking any significant action, she turned southeast. She went toward the ridge. She moved through the forest at her ordinary pace, not sneaking, not announcing herself either, just walking the way she walked, with the natural care of someone who had spent 6 years learning not to disturb what did not need disturbing. She went to the edge of the tree line above the ridge and stopped there in the shadow of the trees and looked down. He was awake. He was sitting by the fire, not facing her direction, reading something. The camp was as she had seen it last night, neat and efficient, the fire burning at exactly the low maintained level she would have kept it at if she were in his position. She stood in the trees and watched him. He did not look up. He did not show any sign of awareness that she was there, though she knew, from what he had said last night from 300 feet away in the dark, that the absence of a sign was not the same as the absence of awareness. She stood there for several minutes. Then she went back to the cabin. She had not been ready, she was not ready. But she had gone to the edge of it, which was more than she had done yesterday, and there was something in that incremental movement that felt less like failure and more like the beginning of something, even if she could not yet name what it was the beginning of. She barred the door and sat down and thought. Tomorrow, she told herself, tomorrow she would know more. She always needed more information before she could make the right decision. Tomorrow she would have it. The fire burned, and outside the forest held its breath, and below the ridge a patient man kept a small fire burning through the afternoon into the evening. And she was here, still here, choosing with each hour she did not pack her bag to stay in the only place that had held her without demanding anything in return. For now, that was all she knew how to do. She stayed. She was in the forest north of the ridge when she heard him moving. Not heard precisely, felt, the way the air in a forest changes quality when something large and certain is moving through it, the way small animals go quiet not out of obvious fear, but out of the more fundamental response to something that outranks them in the hierarchy of things that matter. She had felt it twice before in her life. She had recognized it both times before she consciously understood what she was responding to. She stopped walking. She was half a mile from the cabin, moving along the creek on the north route she used for morning exercise and thought, and the change in the forest reached her, and she stopped and stood still and listened. He was south of her, moving north, not directly toward her, slightly east, which meant he was following the ridge base rather than cutting directly through the terrain. Following the ridge base was the longer route between the camp and the cabin. The direct route was shorter and more obvious. A person who knew the terrain would take the direct route. A person who was being deliberately unhurried, who was giving something or someone ahead of them the maximum possible amount of time to see them coming, would take the ridge base. She stood in the trees and thought about that. Then she started moving, not away from him, not toward him, but sideways, looping east, maintaining distance while she thought. This was the kind of motion that felt like preparation rather than retreat, and she needed the distinction right now more than she needed anything else. She came to a clearing where the trees thinned enough that the winter sky was visible above, pale and cold, and she stopped there in the open space with the sky over her head and thought about what she was doing. She was running lateral to him. She was keeping him in awareness without allowing contact. She was doing the thing she had been doing for 6 years in various forms, staying close enough to something to feel it while staying far enough away to avoid the consequences of feeling it. She turned around. She walked south. Not running and not toward the ridge base where he was moving, but south in a line that would bring her out ahead of him, ahead of his path, between him and the cabin. If he was going to find the cabin, she would prefer to intercept him before he did. She would prefer to control the meeting rather than have it happen to her. She had been having things happen to her for 3 days. She was done with that. She moved quickly and quietly through the trees and came out at the edge of a small clearing south of the creek. A clearing she knew well because she had used it as a reference point when she first mapped this territory years ago. There was a fallen birch across the southern edge of it, thick enough to sit on, old enough to be solid. She sat on it and waited. She did not wait long. He came into the clearing from the east, moving between the trees with that unhurried, settled quality she had watched from the ridge and from the oak tree, and from the edge of the tree line below the ridge. And he stopped when he entered the clearing and saw her sitting on the fallen birch. He did not show surprise. She had not expected him to. He stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at her across 20 feet of open space, and the look was the same as she remembered, that particular quality of attention that he brought to things he considered important, the kind of attention that did not fidget or qualify, that simply rested on the thing in question and waited. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. Her voice sounded strange to her, the roughness of disuse amplified by the cold air. She had spoken almost no words in the last several months. Her voice had lost some of its clarity of tone. She was aware of this in the way she was aware of all the ways 6 years had worked on her, as information rather than judgment. He moved into the clearing and sat down on a stone near the eastern edge, a careful distance from the fallen birch, and she watched him choose his position with the same attention she brought to everything and thought, not for the first time, that she had spent 6 years learning to live alone, and in the process had made herself very good at reading people. because reading people from a distance was the only kind of reading she got to practice. He was tired. She could see it in the way he held himself, not collapsed, nothing about him collapsed, but there was a quality of carried weight to him that she recognized from having watched him carry heavy things in the past. He was wearing it like a coat, something he had gotten used to, but it was there. She did not say anything about it. "You could have left," he said, "last night before morning. The eastern ridge is the clean line out of this territory and you know it, you stayed." "I have not decided anything," she said. He nodded once, not pushing. She watched him not push and thought about how much more manageable it would be if he pushed, because then she would have something clear to resist, a force to press back against, an argument to make. The patience was harder. The patience left everything open, which meant she had to be the one to close it or leave it open, which meant the decision was entirely hers. She had told herself she wanted decisions to be entirely hers. That was the whole project of 6 years, was it not? The recovery of her own agency, the establishment of a life in which nothing happened to her that she had not chosen. She had wanted to be the person who decided, and now she was being given that, the full weight of it, and it was heavier than she had thought. "Why did you come yourself?" she said. He looked at her. "The scouts could have found me," she said. "If anyone could have found me, your scouts could have. You could have sent them with a message. You did not need to be here." "No," he said. "So why?" He was quiet for a moment, not struggling with the answer, she thought, but deciding how much of it to give at once. "Because," he said, "you would have run the moment you knew it was a formal approach. You would have been gone before the scouts returned for their second pass. You have spent 6 years making yourself very hard to find, and you are very good at it, and the only approach that had any chance of actually reaching you was one you did not have time to strategize around." She looked at him. "Me," he said, "in person, alone, no announcement and no formality, just the thing itself." She considered that. "That is either a very calculated approach," she said, "or the actual truth." "It is both," he said, without any particular defensiveness. "The truth and the calculation being the same thing is not a problem, is it?" She thought about that for a moment and decided it was not, or at least not in the way she would have thought when she was younger, and had cleaner ideas about what honesty required. She looked at the trees on the far side of the clearing. A crow moved through the upper branches, its weight bending the branch it landed on and then releasing it, and she watched the branch bounce back and settle. "You said 4 years," she said. "Yes. You have been looking for me for 4 years. "Yes. It has been 6. A pause. She did not look at him. She was watching the crow move along the branch. "Yes," he said. She let that sit in the air between them. She was not going to ask the question it created, not yet. She was going to let him decide if he wanted to offer the answer without being asked, and if he did not, she would know something about what the answer was. He said, "The first 2 years I did not know where to look. I did not know which direction you had gone or what you had taken with you, and the territory is large, and you had given me nothing to work from." She waited. And he said, "In the first 2 years there were other things that needed to be addressed before I could do what I wanted to do." "What things?" she said. He told her, not the full account, not yet. She could sense him calibrating how much to give here, in a clearing, as an opening rather than a full conversation. He told her the shape of it, the state of the pack after she left, the things that needed settling, the particular problem that had required 2 years of careful work before it was finished. He gave her the framework without the details, and she listened, and she read between the lines of it, and what she read between the lines told her things she had not been expecting to hear. When he stopped, she was quiet for a long time. "There are things I need to understand," she said, "before I decide anything." "Yes," he said, "I know, I will tell you whatever you want to know." She stood up from the fallen birch. "Not now," she said. "I need to think about what I want to ask before I ask it. I am not good at answering questions I have not prepared." "Neither am I," he said. She looked at him then, directly, the way she used to before she trained herself to look sideways at things she was afraid of. He held the look without discomfort. "I am going back to the cabin," she said. "I know," he said. "I might come back tomorrow," she said. "I might not." "I will be here," he said. She turned and walked back into the trees. She did not run even then. She walked and she breathed, and her hands at her sides were steady. Behind her, in the clearing, he made no move to follow. She walked back through the forest, through the trees she knew the names of, past the creek and the rock shelf and the stand of young birch and all the places she had learned over 6 years of intimate daily acquaintance, and she felt the forest around her with the new quality that had settled into it over the last 3 days. The held breath quality, the taut quality, as if the whole thing was waiting on a decision she had not yet made. In the cabin, she sat down in the center of the floor. She did not often sit on the floor. She sat on the mat or the single wooden stool she had made herself in the 3rd year. But the floor felt right today, the specific solidness of it, the ground she had packed and maintained with her own hands, in the building she had built with her own hands, in the life she had constructed piece by piece from nothing. She pressed her palms flat against the floor. Then she said, aloud, to the empty cabin, the thing she had been saying for 6 years in the way you say things you need to hear even though you already know them. She had not been wrong to leave. Whatever else was true, that was true. The girl she had been 6 years ago had needed to leave, and the leaving had been the only thing that girl could do. She would not undo it, even now, even sitting on this floor with him 20 minutes behind her in the trees. But the woman she was now was not the girl who had left. That was also true. And the woman she was now was sitting on a floor in a forest that had held her well, and from which she was possibly being asked to step back into the world she had left, and she did not know yet whether that world still fit her or whether she still fit it, and there was only one way to find out, and she was not ready to take it. She was not ready. She had not been ready for 6 years. She pressed harder against the floor. Then she got up and went to the shelf and took down the ingredients for a proper meal, because she was hungry, and because cooking was the thing she did when she needed her hands to be busy and her mind to be given time. She cooked and the fire burned and outside the forest held its breath, and she thought about a clearing and a fallen birch and the specific quality of eyes she had been trying to forget for 6 years and had not entirely succeeded. The meal was ready by the time the last light left the trees. She ate it alone, as she had eaten every meal for 6 years. The taste was exactly as it always was. She cleaned the pot and banked the fire and lay down on the mat and looked at the ceiling, and she thought, tomorrow. Tomorrow she would go back. She would. She told herself that clearly. Tomorrow. She went back. Not at first light, the way the anxious part of her wanted to get it over before she had too much time to talk herself back out of it. She made herself go through the whole morning routine first. Check the snares, prepare food, tend the small maintenance tasks that kept the cabin from slowly giving itself back to the forest. She made herself be ordinary before she allowed herself to go toward the extraordinary thing that was waiting at the edge of her ordinary. She found him where she expected to find him, at the camp below the ridge, occupied with the tasks of the morning in the same unhurried way that she had observed for 2 days now. He heard her coming, she knew that. He was facing away from her direction when she entered the clearing, but there was nothing of surprise in the way his shoulders shifted when she arrived, just acknowledgement. He had kept the fire going through the morning. That was considerate. In this cold, a fire that had died meant half an hour of cold hands before you could sit near anything warm, and she had not eaten anything warm since early that morning. She went to the fire and sat across it from him. He poured something from a small pot into a cup and set it on the ground between them. She took it, it was warm, herbed, something woody and calming, and she held it in both hands and looked at the fire and thought about how many times in 6 years she had sat by a fire alone and what it felt like to sit by a fire with another person present. It felt very different. She had forgotten how much it felt different. "Tell me about the pack," she said. Now he sounded mildly surprised, just mildly, at the specificity of where she was starting. "I want to understand what I am potentially walking back into," she said. "Before we talk about anything else, the political situation, the structure, what has changed." He told her. He was a precise reporter, which she had always found useful. He did not editorialize or shape the facts toward any particular conclusion. He gave her the information and let her draw her own pictures from it, which was the only kind of information she had ever really trusted. He told her about the 6 packs under the Ironwood umbrella, the relationships between them, which had shifted over the past several years, and in what directions and why. He told her about the internal changes to the Ironwood pack itself, the people who had risen in responsibility and the people who had stepped back, the structural decisions he had made about governance, and how those had been received. She listened with total attention. She had always been a good listener, one of those people who listened with their whole body, who gave the speaking person the impression that every word was being received and weighed and integrated, not just heard and passed through. She had not had much to listen to in 6 years. The quality of her attention, returning it now to a person who was saying things worth attending to, felt like a muscle being used after a long rest. She asked questions, precise ones, specific ones, the kind of questions that told him something about what she was paying attention to and what she understood about how things worked. He answered them with the same precision she brought to the asking. 2 hours passed like that. At the end of the 2 hours, she set her empty cup down on the ground and looked at the fire and thought about everything he had told her, which was a great deal, and what she understood from it, which was that the world she had left 6 years ago had changed substantially, and had also, in some fundamental ways, remained the same. Both of those things were both reassuring and difficult. "The people who blamed me," she said, "are they still in the pack?" He was quiet for a moment. "That," he said, "is what I need to talk to you about." She looked at him. "Not today," he said. "There are things I need to tell you that I want to tell you properly. When we have more time and you have more context, today was the beginning, there is more." She held his gaze for a moment. "Tomorrow," she said. "Yes," he said. She stood up. "I am going back," she said, "but I will come in the morning." She walked back to the cabin through the trees, and for the first time in 6 years she walked toward her home and felt, beneath the apprehension and the caution and the weight of all the things that still needed to be resolved, something that was not quite relief and not quite anticipation, but lived somewhere in the territory between them. She would come in the morning, and whatever he was going to tell her, she would hear it. She was tired of not hearing things. She was tired of the silence she had chosen, and the things she did not know because she had built her life around not knowing them. And she was tired of the particular kind of loneliness that came from having made yourself very small in a very large forest and called it freedom. She barred the door and lay down and looked at the ceiling. The fire burned low. Tomorrow she would go back and she would hear the rest of it. And whatever the rest of it was, she would not run from it. She had decided. Finally, after 6 years, she had decided. She went to the camp the next morning at the hour she had told herself she would go, and she sat across the fire from him and she said nothing for the first several minutes. He let her have the silence. He had, she was noticing, an unusual quality of tolerance for silence, the kind that did not fill it with smaller talk but simply coexisted with it. She had a fire between her and the thing she needed to hear. That felt appropriate. "Tell me," she said. He did not ask tell me what, he knew. He started at the beginning, which was the same beginning she knew, the battle on the eastern ridge 6 years ago, the decisions made and the things that went wrong, the death of Owen, who had been 22 years old, and who had been in the wrong position at the wrong time for reasons that were no one's fault because battle was full of wrong positions and wrong times, and you could not always know in advance which positions and which times those would be. She had known that. She had always known that somewhere below the guilt. Caius told her what she already knew first, and then he told her what she did not know. What she did not know was what had happened after. Specifically, who had been in the camp on the evening of the battle in the hours after she had left, when the accounting was being done and the story of what had happened was being shaped into the version that the pack would carry forward. Who had been present for that conversation? What had been said? And what interest the person who had done most of the talking had in shaping it a particular way? She listened. She kept her eyes on the fire. She watched the flames work over the wood and she let the words land and she organized them against the architecture of what she already believed, testing each piece against the structure, finding where it fit and where it did not. Where it did not fit. Where it absolutely did not fit. She had been the one they pointed to. The decision that had placed Owen in the wrong position, the decision that had come from her command, the chain of events that led from her order to his position to his death. That was the version. She had carried it as truth because it had the texture of truth, because it mapped onto something she could have done, because she had been so deep in her own grief and shock that she had not had the capacity to question it. She had just believed it. She had walked out of the pack and into the forest believing it, and she had built 6 years of her life on top of that belief, the way you build on bedrock, assuming it will hold. The bedrock was wrong. Caius laid it out in the methodical way he did things that required precision. The actual sequence of events on that ridge, confirmed from 3 separate sources over 2 years of investigation. The specific order that had been given, who had given it, and when. The chain of command that morning, and who had had the authority to place Owen where Owen was placed. Not her. It had not been her order. It had not been her decision. She had been in a different position on the ridge when the placement was made, a position that was documented and confirmed, and the order that put Owen where he died had come from someone else and had been attributed to her by the only person who had been present for both the order and the aftermath. She sat with the fire and she let that unfold in her mind. She did not cry. She was not sure she was capable of crying right now, not because she was not feeling anything but because she was feeling too much, and she had always run cold on the exterior when the interior was most active. It was a quality she had been told more than once in her life was difficult. She had never been entirely able to decide whether that was true or not. Who, she said. One word. He said the name. She closed her eyes. The name was not a surprise, exactly. It was more like the confirmation of a suspicion she had never let herself hold long enough to look at clearly. In the days after the battle and Owen's death, in the chaos and the grief and the reshaping of events that she had been too stunned to interrogate, there had been one voice that had been especially clear and especially certain about what had happened and who was responsible for it. She had registered that clarity at the time as the clarity of someone who had been close enough to see clearly. It had not been that. How long have you known? She said. 2 years, he said. I suspected longer. I needed evidence that was unambiguous before I was certain. 2 years, he had been certain for 2 years. And before that he had been suspecting, and before that he had been looking for her, and before that was the 2 years after she left when he did not know where she was. Why did it take 2 years to find me? She said. You were careful, he said. Genuinely careful. You left nothing useful behind and you moved in directions that were not predictable, and the territory you chose was one that no one thought to search with any seriousness, because no one who knew you would have thought you would go so far into unclaimed wilderness. She registered that as a kind of backwards compliment. And when you found me, she said, why did you come yourself? He had answered a version of this question the previous morning. She was asking again because she wanted the full answer, not the calibrated one. He was quiet for a moment. Because, he said, the message that needed to be delivered was not one I was willing to trust to a representative. What I needed to tell you is something you deserve to hear from me directly, not from a scout, not from a letter, from me. She opened her eyes and looked at him. And the other reason, she said. A pause. Because I needed to see you, he said, not dramatically. Just as a fact, delivered with the same flatness he delivered everything factual, and it sat in the air between them with the weight of a thing that has been waiting a long time to be said. She looked at the fire. She thought about Owen, about the 22-year-old who had died on a ridge in a battle that ended badly, and about the 6 years she had spent carrying the weight of something that was not hers to carry, that had been placed on her by someone who needed it placed somewhere. She thought about that person. The one whose name he had said. She had questions about what had happened to them, what the consequence had been, whether there had been any accounting. She would ask those questions, not today, today was full enough. His family, she said, Owen's family. They know, he said. The correct account was delivered to them 18 months ago. They received it as well as they could. She nodded. Owen's family. She had thought about them sometimes in the quietest nights in the cabin, wondered what they had been told and what they believed, and whether they had carried their grief cleanly or tangled up in anger at her. She had assumed the anger. The anger had been part of what she carried. She had been carrying other people's anger at a version of events that was not true. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs. What happened to them, she said, the person, after you confirmed it? Removed from the pack, he said. Formally and completely, no contact with any Ironwood territory. That decision was made and implemented before I came looking for you. I needed it to be done before I asked you to consider coming back. She absorbed that. He had not come to her with an open question and a still unresolved situation. He had come after the investigation was completed and the conclusion confirmed and the consequence carried out, after the path was cleared. You could have sent word, she said. When you knew, you could have sent a message with the information and left the choice to me without coming yourself. Yes, he said. But you did not. No. Because. He held her gaze. Because I was not going to hear second-hand whether you decided to come back, he said. And because there are things that need to be said between people rather than through messengers, and I had several of those things to say. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up. He made no move. I am going to walk, she said. I need to think. I will be back. I know, he said. She went into the forest. Not fast, not slow, the same pace she used for thinking walks, the pace that allowed her mind to move at a different speed from her feet, the one that let things settle and arrange themselves. She walked north along the creek, and she thought about Owen, and she thought about 6 years, and she thought about the careful, quiet, stripped-down life she had made in this forest, and what it had cost, and what it had given her, and what it was, and what it was not. She had made something real here, she knew that. She had not wasted 6 years. She had learned things about herself that she might not have learned any other way, learned them in the deep and permanent way that only solitude and difficulty teach. She had become someone capable and self-sufficient and resilient in ways she had not been before she left, and she did not regret that. She only regretted that she had needed to leave in order to learn those things. She only regretted the lie that had sent her here. She came to the flat rock above the creek. She sat on it. Below her, the water moved with its usual indifference, going where it was going regardless of what she decided. She thought about what he had said, about the 2 years and the investigation and the consequence, and the fact that he had come himself. She thought about what those things added up to when she looked at them together rather than separately. She had been building a life around a wrong story for 6 years. The life itself was not wrong. The life itself was real, and she had made it, and she was not ashamed of it. But the story underneath it, the reason she had built it here and not somewhere else, the reason she had hidden and not simply left, that story was wrong. And now she knew it was wrong. And she was sitting on a rock in a forest she had chosen for hiding, with the person she had been hiding from, not from, she corrected herself, that was not quite right, with the person she had been hiding around camp 20 minutes south of her, telling her the truth. She sat on the rock for a long time. Then she walked back. He was where she had left him, the fire a little lower now, the morning well into midday. He looked up when she came back into the clearing. She sat down across from him. There are still things I do not know, she said. Yes, he said. And things that will take time. Yes. I am not going to make a decision today. I am not going to promise anything today. I am not asking you to, he said. She looked at the fire. But I am not leaving either, she said, not yet. He was quiet. I need you to understand that I am not the same as I was 6 years ago, she said. I am not that girl. I will not be able to simply pick up where things left off as if the time in between did not happen. I know, he said, I am not asking for that. She looked at him. What are you asking for, she said. He met her eyes. The conversation, he said, that is all. The conversation we should have had 6 years ago, I am asking for that. She considered this for a moment. Then she nodded. I can do that, she said. She looked back at the fire. The flames worked at the wood with their patient, indifferent energy, and the cold air moved through the clearing, and around them the forest went about its business, and she sat across from him with the fire between them and the 6 years between them and the unfinished conversation between them, and she felt it all begin, very slowly and not without pain, to shift. Things that have been still for a very long time make noise when they start to move. She sat in the noise of it, and she did not run from it. That was something. That was actually quite a lot. The conversation lasted the rest of the afternoon. It was not a comfortable conversation. She had not expected it to be. She had spent 6 years not having it, and the material had been accumulating all that time. The things said and unsaid, the decisions made under the pressure of a false story, the choices she would have made differently if she had known the truth. All of that had weight, and weight could not be unpacked quietly. She asked about Owen's last known hours. He answered. She asked about the investigation, the specific evidence, how he had been certain. He laid it out point by point, the way she had asked him for things in the past, when she needed precision over comfort. He gave her precision. She asked about the pack's response to the corrected account. He told her honestly, which meant not all of it was clean. Some people had been angry that it had taken this long to surface the truth. Some people had been angry at her by habit for so long that the truth had not immediately changed their feelings, only the justification for them. Some people had found the correction of the story difficult to process because they had built structures of understanding on top of the original version. She appreciated that he did not smooth those parts over. "What about you?" she said at some point in the middle of the afternoon. "What was your response when you first suspected the story was wrong?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Relief," he said. She looked at him. "At first," he said, "the immediate response was relief, because if the story was wrong, it meant you were not what the story made you. And I had known the person you were before all of this, and the story had never quite mapped onto that person, and I had spent 2 years trying to square that, the story against the person, and it had not squared." She was quiet. "And then," he said, "when the relief passed, there was something more difficult, because if the story was wrong, it meant I had let it stand longer than it should have been allowed to stand. Not without reason, not without trying to find the truth, but longer than I would have liked. And you had been in the forest for that time, and the forest was not where you should have been, and that was partly attributable to how long the wrong story stood." She looked at the fire. "It is not your responsibility," she said. "The story was not yours to have stopped. You did not create it." "No," he said, "but I led the people who were told it, which means the responsibility for what it did to them and what it did to you belongs at least partly with me." She thought about that. She thought about responsibility, about the distribution of it, about how it settled across the people involved in a thing. She had spent 6 years carrying what she believed was her portion of it, and it had nearly flattened her. She did not have any appetite left for assigning portions. "I do not need you to take responsibility for it," she said. "I need you to tell me the truth about it. You have done that." He nodded. "Then we are at the same place," she said. The fire burned lower. The light in the clearing had moved from the hard-edged winter afternoon brightness into the softer, longer shadows of late afternoon, and the cold was beginning to deepen in the way it did once the light started going, a settling in of the chill that would be genuinely biting by nightfall. She had not noticed the cold while they were talking. She noticed it now. "I should go back before dark," she said. "Yes," he said. She stood, she brushed the cold from her coat and looked at him for a moment, this person she had been afraid of seeing for 6 years, this person who was less frightening than the version of him she had been carrying. "Tomorrow," she said. He looked up at her. "I want to hear about the pack from the beginning," she said. "From when I left, everything. The whole account." He nodded. "Then tomorrow," she said, and she turned and walked back into the trees. She did not look back. She did not need to. He was there and he would be there in the morning, and she would go back, and they would continue the conversation that she had been refusing to have for 6 years, and at the end of it she would have the information she needed to make the decision she had been putting off for the same length of time. She was not afraid of the conversation anymore. She was not finished being afraid of the other things, the larger things, the things that lived past the conversation and would need to be faced once the conversation was done. But the conversation itself she could do. She walked through the forest in the last light, and the trees moved around her as they always did, and the cold came in as it always did, and everything was exactly as it always was and completely different from how it had always been, and she held both of those things at once as she walked and found, to her surprise, that she could. The cabin was warm when she reached it. She had banked the fire well before she left that morning, and it had held. She stood inside the door for a moment and looked at the 4 walls and the shelf and the sleeping mat and the knife hanging in its leather wrap and all the small permanent things of a life she had built. She fed the fire. She made food. She ate, and she thought about Owen, and she thought about 6 years, and she thought about tomorrow, and she was present for all of it, sitting in her own quiet life with the door barred and the fire going and the long, ordinary evening ahead of her, but present differently than she had been before. Something had opened. She did not know yet what would come through it. But she was done closing it. She was in the tree above his camp before dawn. She would have preferred to think of this as strategic, as reconnaissance, as the kind of reasonable precautionary observation that a person with her habits and her history would naturally undertake. She would have preferred to believe that she was in the oak tree 40 feet above his camp before first light, because she was gathering information. She had been gathering information for 6 years, and she knew what that looked and felt like, and what she was doing in this tree at this hour was not that. What she was doing was looking at him. He was asleep below her, one arm folded behind his head, breathing with the steady, even cadence of someone who had learned to sleep in the field and did it without apparent difficulty. She watched him sleep, and she let herself notice, without immediately converting the noticing into something else or covering it with something more manageable, what it felt like to watch a person she had known very well sleep in the quiet before dawn. It felt like the 6 years had been too long. She had known that before she came down from the tree. She had known it in the forest the previous afternoon and the evening before that, and probably, if she was honest, since the moment on the ridge when she had seen him moving through the trees below her and her body had responded before she had given it permission. But knowing a thing and allowing yourself to know it were different things, and she had been working on allowing, which was harder, and which required that she stop looking away from it. She was not looking away. He opened his eyes. Directly, not the gradual surfacing of someone waking from genuine sleep, but the immediate clarity of someone who had been awake and waiting for a particular moment. His eyes went straight to the branch where she was sitting, without searching, without the scanning that someone truly uncertain of a location would do. He had known she was there. She did not move. "Good morning," he said to the branch. She said nothing. He sat up and moved to the fire and rebuilt it from the banked coals with the efficiency she had been watching for 3 mornings now, the same process each time, the same economy of motion. He was a person of consistent habits, she had always known that, and watching the habits from a tree at 40 feet felt like reading a sentence in a language she had studied for years, and then not spoken, and was now, with some surprise, discovering she could still read fluently. He put water on. He reached into the pack beside him and brought out a round of bread, and broke it in half, and set the second half on the stone at the edge of the fire ring. She looked at the bread. She was genuinely cold. She had been in the tree for an hour before dawn, and the cold had penetrated through the coat in the particular way that cold does when you are still for a long time, settling into the joints and the back of the neck and the ends of the fingers. And she was hungry, having eaten nothing since the previous evening. She looked at the bread for a long moment. Then she came down. She landed at the edge of the camp, and he did not start or reach for anything, just looked at her with a quality of unsurprised attention that she was coming to associate specifically with him, the way you associate a specific quality of light with a specific time of day. He looked at her as if her arrival was the expected continuation of something rather than a deviation from it. She crossed to the stone and picked up the bread and sat down across the fire from him. She ate it without speaking. It was good bread, simple, made without anything excess, the kind of food that traveled well and kept, and did not require conditions to eat. She had not eaten bread made by another person in 6 years. She had not realized until this moment that that was something she had missed. He poured 2 cups from the pot and set one on her side of the fire without comment, the same way he had done the previous morning at the camp below the ridge, the same quiet assumption that she would want it, without asking, without making the offer into a moment. She picked it up. They sat in the early morning quiet with the fire between them and the forest around them, and neither of them said anything for a long time, and the quality of the silence was different again this morning, different from all the previous silences between them. It had lost the compression of things being held back. It was just quiet, 2 people sitting in a quiet morning with coffee and bread. She could not remember the last time she had sat in a quiet morning with another person. She held the cup with both hands and looked at the fire. "You knew I was in the tree," she said. "Yes," he said. "For how long?" "I heard you climb it," he said. "You make very little noise, but the bark on that oak at that height is dry and it shifts under weight. I woke up about 10 minutes before I opened my eyes." She considered this. "Why did you pretend to still be asleep?" she said. "Because you needed to decide when you were ready to come down," he said. "And that was not a decision I was going to make for you." She looked at him across the fire. "You are very careful about that," she said, "about leaving the decisions to me." "Yes," he said. "Is that natural," she said, "or is it specifically because of me?" A pause. Both, he said. She looked back at the fire. She thought about that. She had spent 6 years in a life where every single decision was hers, where nothing happened to her that she had not chosen or that she could not respond to with the full authority of her own judgment. That was what she had built here, the completeness of her own agency. And here was this person, sitting across from her, who had been specifically and deliberately not overriding that agency since the moment he arrived, who had given her the exit route, who had told her he would not follow, who had set bread on a stone and waited, who had stayed awake with his eyes closed while she made up her mind in a tree above him. She thought about that kind of patience and what it cost. She knew something about patience. She had spent 6 years being patient with herself, waiting for herself to be ready for things, allowing herself as much time as she needed. She knew it was not always easy. I could have left yesterday, she said, or the day before or the day before that. I had multiple opportunities. Yes, he said. You know why I did not, she said. It was not a question. I think so, he said. Tell me what you think, she said. He held her gaze. Because you are not only afraid, he said. You are also curious, and the curiosity has always been stronger than the fear in you, and you needed enough information before you could do anything with it, and you were getting the information. She looked at the fire. He was not entirely wrong. He had not been entirely wrong about her in the past either, which had been one of the things that had made him difficult to leave and difficult to stop thinking about, that he had always been able to read her more accurately than she was comfortable with. She had not thought he would be able to do it still, after 6 years of separation, after the changes that 6 years had made to both of them. He could still do it. She was not sure if that was reassuring or alarming. She filed it away to assess later, when there was less immediately pressing. There are things I still need to understand, she said. Yes, he said. About the pack, about what coming back would actually look like, about what people would. She started again. The people who spent 6 years believing what they believed about me, even with the corrected account, that does not go away overnight. No, he said, it does not. And I would need to address that directly, she said. I am not going to come back and pretend the 6 years did not happen and that people do not have complicated feelings about it. That is not something I am willing to do. I would not expect you to, he said. And I am different, she said. I need you to understand that. I am not the same person who left. I have been alone for 6 years and it has changed me in ways that I am not entirely finished discovering yet, and anyone who expected me to simply resume being who I was would be wrong. I know, he said. She looked at him. You keep saying that, she said. I know. Do you actually know, or are you saying it because it is the correct response? He was quiet for a moment. Both, he said again, with the particular precision she was starting to find both frustrating and somehow comforting. The way things that are exact can be comforting even when they are not what you wanted to hear. She let out a breath. I am not the same either, he said. 6 years is a long time and things have happened in it, and I am not who I was in the ways that matter, and I am still who I was in the ways that apparently also matter, and I expect you are the same. She looked at him. Probably, she said. A pause. Then she said, I need to walk, I will be back. He nodded. He made no move to follow. She went into the forest, and she walked the creek route north, her thinking route, the one she used when she needed her feet moving and the space around her open. She walked. She thought about what coming back would actually mean, not in the abstract, not as a concept, but in practice, in the concrete daily reality of it. A settlement with 200 people in it, faces she knew and faces she did not, history she shared and history that had accumulated without her. The practical adjustments, the social adjustments, the adjustments to being known again after the long relief of being unknown. She was not afraid of the practical things. She had proven to herself over 6 years that she could handle practical things. She was good at practical things. She was afraid of the other things. The things you could not prepare for. The moments that would arrive without warning and would ask something of her she did not know yet if she had. She thought about being afraid, and she thought about the 6 years of fear she had carried, and how much of it she had converted into something else, into competence and knowledge, and the specific kind of hardness that was not brittleness, but was instead the density of something that had been compressed over time. She had been afraid for a very long time. She was tired of it being the thing that set the limits of her life. She turned around and walked back. He was where she had left him, the fire lower now, the morning moving toward midday. He looked up when she came in. She sat down across from him. "Tell me what happens next," she said. "Practically, if I decide to come back, what does that actually look like?" He told her. He was precise and concrete, which was what she had asked for, and he told her the practical things. Where things stood, what the structure looked like, what her position would be if she returned, what rights and responsibilities that position carried. He told her about the people who would be glad and the people who would not be immediately glad, and he was honest about the proportion of both, which she appreciated. She listened and she asked questions, and the morning moved toward afternoon. At some point in the middle of all of it, she realized that she had stopped thinking of this as a hypothetical. She was thinking about it as a plan. She sat with that realization for a moment. Then she thought, when did that happen? She thought about the bread on the stone. She thought about the tree and the open eyes. She thought about 4 years of searching and 2 years of investigation and the particular patience of a man who had let her come down from the tree in her own time. She did not have all the answers. She did not know yet how all the difficult things would resolve. She did not know if the person she was now could fit back into the place she had left, or if that place would have to change to fit her, or some combination of both. She did not know those things. But she was thinking about it as a plan. And that was something she had not done in 6 years. She looked at him across the fire. "I am going to need more time," she said, "to think about the specifics. But I think I am." She stopped. She tried again. "I think I am close to a decision," she said. He looked at her. He did not say anything. But something in his face changed, very slightly, in the way that something changes when a weight has been carried for a long time and is briefly, partially lifted. She looked at the fire. "Tomorrow," she said, "I need tomorrow, and then I will know." "Tomorrow," he said. She stood and went back to the cabin, and she walked the whole way thinking about the decision she had not quite made, turning it over, examining it, looking for the flaws and the uncertainties, and all the reasons it was more complicated than it appeared. She found them, they were there, all of them, real and serious. And she also found, when she arrived at the cabin and stood in the doorway and looked at the 4 walls she had built, and the fire she had built, and the life she had built out of the necessity of having nowhere else to be, that the decision was already made. She had not known it until she looked. But there it was. She went inside. She had 1 day left. Tomorrow she would tell him. She spent that evening the way she spent important evenings, doing ordinary things with unusual attention. She cleaned the cabin in the specific way she cleaned it when she was preparing to leave, the thorough method rather than the maintenance method, attending to corners and surfaces she usually left until they were visibly in need of it. She checked her supply stores and made notes in the small notebook she kept for tracking quantities, the habit of accurate accounting that she had maintained through all 6 years. She repaired a small split in the wooden shelf that she had been noting for weeks without addressing. She did not do these things because she had decided to leave. She did not yet know whether she was going to pack the cabin down properly or simply walk away from it. She did them because her hands needed to be busy while her mind worked, and because there was something in the act of tending a space you had lived in that felt like saying goodbye to it properly, regardless of whether the goodbye was final. By the time the fire burned low, she had cleaned and checked and repaired everything she could think of, and the cabin was as orderly as it had been on the day she moved into it, and she sat in the middle of the clean floor and looked around at the 4 walls, and she thought about all the ways this place had held her. It had held her very well. She was going to be honest about that. The forest had not been punishment or exile or merely survival. It had been, in the ways that mattered, exactly what she had needed it to be. A place to stop and to breathe and to become the version of herself that was not built on the wrong story. She had done that here. She was not going to leave it ashamed of having been here, or in a hurry to deny the years she had spent. She was going to leave it, if she left it, with the same clear accounting she brought to everything else. She got up and went to the shelf and took down the knife in its leather wrap and turned it over in her hands. She had sharpened it nearly every morning for 6 years. It was the same knife she had arrived with, the one thing she had taken from her previous life that was still in use, unchanged in its function, its edge maintained through consistent attention. She had not let it get dull. She had not let anything she relied on get dull. She put it back on the shelf. She lay down and looked at the ceiling. Tomorrow. She was going to tell him tomorrow, and then she was going to find out what the consequences of telling him were. And those consequences would unfold the way consequences always did, in ways that were partly predictable and partly not, and she was going to move through them with the same attention and the same care she had brought to 6 years of living in a forest. She was not afraid. She was not finished being cautious, and she was not finished being careful, and she had no illusions about how difficult the coming months were going to be, the adjustments and the friction and the days when she would wonder if she had made the right decision. But she was not afraid. She closed her eyes. Outside, the forest breathed its usual evening breath, deep and cold and steady, and somewhere below the ridge a small fire burned through the night, and she lay in her own darkness, and for the first time in a long time the darkness did not feel like something she needed to keep at bay. It just felt like the night before the next thing. She slept, properly fully, without the light sleep of someone keeping one ear open. She slept the way she had not slept in a week, since before the transit marking on the pale birch tree, and she woke in the morning feeling the particular clarity of someone who has made a decision that has been too long in the making, and now has the quiet relief of having made it. She made tea. She ate. She put on her coat and she picked up the knife from the shelf and attached it at her belt, which was where it would travel from here, and she stood in the doorway of the cabin she had built, and she looked at it for a moment. Then she walked to the camp below the ridge. He looked up when she came into the clearing. She sat down. "I am going to pack some things," she said. "The food stores can be sealed and will keep through the winter. The cabin will keep, I can leave it." He was very still. "I am not saying this means everything is decided," she said. "There are still things I need to address and things that will take time and things I will not know until I am in them. I am saying I am ready to go back and address them." He said nothing. She had the sense he was being careful with the silence. "I am also saying," she said, looking at the fire rather than at him, "that I believe what you told me. About Owen, about the investigation, about what actually happened on that ridge. I believe it, and I am going to need time with it, with what it means, with everything that it changes about the last 6 years. But I believe it." "I know," he said quietly. "And I am going to be difficult," she said. "Going back is not going to be simple, and I am not going to pretend it will be, and I will need you to not pretend it will be either." "I am not pretending anything," he said. She finally looked at him. He was watching her with the same quality of attention he had brought to everything, the steady kind, the kind that did not flicker or qualify. "All right," she said, "then I need a day to prepare the cabin, one day, and then we will go." He nodded once. She stood up. She walked back into the trees and went back to the cabin and began the work of preparing a space you are leaving, maybe for a long time, maybe forever, the specific care of someone who does not know which and has decided to treat it as the former without being naive enough to rule out the latter. She worked all day. By the time the light began to fail, she was done, and the cabin was sealed and the stores were covered and the fire was properly out, and the door would bar from the outside with the simple latch she had always used, and she stood in the doorway one last time and looked at the space. 4 walls, a packed earth floor, a shelf, a hearth, a shutter. Home for 6 years. She pulled the door shut. She walked back through the trees in the failing light and she did not look back, and the forest moved around her in its usual way, and the cold came in as it always did, and she was walking toward the edge of the life she had built rather than deeper into it, and it felt like both a loss and the beginning of something she did not yet have words for. She reached the camp below the ridge as the last light was leaving the sky. He had kept the fire going. She sat down beside it and held her cold hands toward the warmth, and he sat across from her, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the night settled in around them, and she thought, one more night. Tomorrow they would walk out. She looked at the fire. One more night. She could do that. She woke the next morning feeling what she did not have a clean word for yet, something between resolution and the particular lightness that comes after a long-held breath is finally released. The camp was quiet. He was awake already, sitting by a small rebuilt fire with the same quality of inhabited stillness she had been observing all week. He did not speak when she appeared from the sleeping position she had taken at the edge of the camp the night before, the position that was close but not very close, the position of someone who had made a decision but had not yet had time to fully integrate what came with it. She sat across the fire. She held out her hands to the warmth, not speaking. He poured tea, she took it. The morning moved around them. The birds began in the canopy above, the small sounds of the forest starting its day, and she sat in the center of those sounds and felt how familiar they were, how deeply she had come to know them over 6 years of mornings in this forest, and she thought about the fact that tomorrow morning she would be hearing a different set of sounds. She was not afraid. She was paying attention. There was a difference. "I need to understand one more thing," she said. He looked at her. "The person," she said, "the one whose name you told me. I have been thinking about them, and there are things I need to understand about what happened and why it happened the way it did. Not the mechanics of the investigation. I understand that. The reasons, the motivation, why they did it." He was quiet for a moment. She could tell this was a question he had prepared for, that he had anticipated she would come to it, that he had his own thoughts about it, and had been deciding when to offer them. "They were afraid," he said. She waited. "What happened on that ridge was genuinely chaotic," he said. "The battle did not go the way it was planned, and there were several people in positions of command who made decisions under pressure that they then had to account for afterward. Owen's death was one consequence of several decisions made by several people in a bad situation, and the accounting afterward was never going to be clean. Someone was going to bear the formal weight of it. And they decided that someone should be me," she said. "They decided," he said, "that the distribution of blame should fall on the person least positioned to contest it. You had already left. You were not present to give your account. Your absence made you convenient, and your rank made the attribution credible, and the grief of the people around them made them willing to accept an explanation without examining it too carefully." She looked at the fire. She thought about that. She thought about being convenient, about the specific quality of vulnerability that comes from being absent, about the way a story can shape itself around a gap in a way that fills the gap but does not describe what was actually there. She had been a gap. She had been afraid to come back, and so she had not come back, and her absence had become the story. "They were afraid of accountability themselves," she said. "Yes," he said, "and frightened people in positions of authority do what frightened people do. They look for somewhere to put the thing they are afraid of." She nodded slowly. She had known that. She had understood it in the abstract for years, the psychology of it, the way fear and authority combine to produce certain outcomes. She had just not applied that understanding to this specific situation because applying it would have required her to question a story she had been using to explain her own life. "It does not make it acceptable," she said. "No," he said, "it does not." "And the consequence you described," she said, "removal from the pack, does that feel proportionate to you?" He considered the question seriously, the way he always considered questions that required honesty rather than convenience. "Proportionate is a complicated word," he said. "The harm done was significant, and the impact was long, and the person has lost everything they valued. Whether that maps onto proportionate is something I do not know how to calculate." "But you made the decision." "Yes, without consulting me." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said, "you were not findable when the decision was made. I made the best decision I could with the authority I had and the information I had. If you had been there, you would have been part of that decision. You were not there." She looked at the fire. "I would have made the same decision," she said. "I thought so," he said. "That does not mean I am not bothered by not having been consulted," she said. "I know," he said. "I am sorry for that." She heard the apology and did not dismiss it. She sat with it and turned it over and decided it was genuine, which it clearly was, and she also decided that it did not need anything else from her right now except to be received. "All right," she said. The morning moved. She looked at the sky above the clearing, the winter sky, pale and cold and very clear. The kind of clarity you only got at this altitude in this season, when there was no moisture left in the air to scatter the light. I want to talk about Owen, she said. Not about what happened, I have enough of that now, I want to talk about him, who he was. Caius looked at her. He was 22, she said. I know that number, but I did not know him well. He had only been in the eastern section for a few months before the battle. I want to know who he was. Caius was quiet for a moment, and she could see him going back through his own memory of Owen, the particular quality of someone retrieving a person they had known and cared for rather than just an account of an event. He was funny, Caius said, not in a performed way. He found the absurdity in things and he said it quietly, and the people around him would laugh before they understood why. He was training for long-range work, wanted eventually to be a tracker, had a gift for it. He read everything he could find about terrain and animal behavior. He asked better questions than most people twice his age. She listened. He was afraid of heights, Caius said. He had managed his training for it and he was competent, but he did not like it, and he was honest about not liking it, which I always thought was a good quality in someone training for positions where dishonesty about your limitations could get other people killed. She thought about a 22-year-old who was funny and curious and honest about heights. She thought about what it meant to have spent 6 years carrying the guilt of his death and how that was going to change now, not disappear, because you did not simply stop grieving a person when the circumstances of their death were clarified, but change, shift into something different, a grief that was not contaminated by guilt, just a grief. She was going to carry Owen differently after this. She was glad to know who to carry. Thank you, she said. He nodded. They sat in the morning quiet for a while after that, not talking, and it was a clean kind of quiet, the kind that was between people rather than around them. Eventually she stood up. I need to do one more thing before we leave, she said. He looked at her. There is a place on the ridge, she said. I go there sometimes. I need to go there before we leave. Alone, I will be back within the hour. He nodded. She went up the ridge. The climb was familiar, every handhold and every foothold known in the way that the body knows the routes it has repeated many times, the knowledge that is stored in the muscles rather than the mind. She climbed without effort, and the cold air worked at her face, and by the time she reached the top her blood was moving the way it moved when she had done something physical in the cold, warm and quick and present. She sat on the flat rock at the highest point of the ridge, and she looked south and east at the forest she had lived in for 6 years. From up here the scale of it was visible in a way it was not when you were inside it. A vast, dark, rolling space of trees and stone and frozen waterways, stretching to the horizon in every direction, indifferent and enormous and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are entirely themselves, with no concession to anything outside themselves. She had loved it. She was going to be honest about that, the same way she had been honest about the cabin and about what 6 years of living here had given her. She had loved this place. It had been difficult and lonely and sometimes frightening, and it had asked more of her than she had sometimes been sure she could give, and she had loved it, and it had made her someone she was glad to be. She sat on the rock and she said goodbye to the forest in her mind, not out loud, because that felt like more ceremony than the moment needed. Just in her mind, a specific and honest thank you. Then she got up and climbed down. He had broken camp when she returned. Everything was packed and organized and ready, the fire properly put out, the ground around the camp raked back to as close to its original state as possible. He was standing with the pack on his back, ready, patient. She looked at the camp. You have been ready to leave for days, she said. Yes, he said. You were waiting for me. Yes, he said. She picked up her own pack from where she had left it at the edge of the camp. She put it on. She looked at the ridge above them. The scouts, she said, are they meeting us? They are waiting at the western edge of the forest, he said, 2 miles out. She nodded. Lead or follow, she said. Your choice, he said. She turned west. She walked. He walked beside her and not behind her, not ahead, which was a choice that she registered and appreciated without needing to comment on, because sometimes the things that matter most are exactly as simple as they appear. They walked through the forest she knew better than she had ever known anything else, and the trees moved around her, and the cold was clean and clear, and she was walking through it into whatever came next, with her pack on her back and her knife at her belt, and 6 years of herself accumulated in the way she held her shoulders, and the way she set her feet, and the specific quality of attention she brought to the world, which was different from the girl who had walked into this forest and was hers. She took it with her. Into the trees, into the morning, into the distance that kept shortening between her and the world she had left, and was now, step by step, choosing to re-enter. She walked. They walked for most of the morning. She had known this forest intimately for 6 years, but she had never walked it westward in the way she walked it now, with deliberate direction rather than circular maintenance. The familiar trees passed on either side of her in a different order than she was used to seeing them, the west-facing aspects of stones and trunks she knew only from the east, and the effect was a slight but persistent sense of displacement, of seeing something she knew in a changed light. She was used to displacement by now. She had been displacing herself in one way or another for most of the past week. They did not talk much while they walked. The terrain in places required attention, and she was glad for that, glad to have something concrete to navigate that was not the interior landscape she had been working through for days. The old-growth pines gave way to a section of younger birch, dense and pale, and then to a mixed section where the ground was softer and the evidence of animal traffic was everywhere in the mud. She read the animal signs as she passed them from habit, the way she always read the forest, and she caught herself noting a deer track and calculating its age and thinking about whether it would be worth setting a snare at that particular junction. And then she caught herself thinking that, and something both funny and not funny moved through her chest. She was not going to be setting snares at that junction. She was not going to be setting snares anywhere in this forest. Not now, maybe not for a long time. She kept walking. They stopped once briefly at a stream crossing, and she drank from the stream the way she had drunk from this stream and every stream in this territory for 6 years. And the water was cold and clean, and tasted of the stone it had come off, and she stood up with the water on her lips and thought, I am going to miss this. That was true and simple, and she did not argue with it. How long before we reach the scouts, she said. Less than an hour now, he said. We are past the midpoint. She nodded. They kept walking. The trees began to thin incrementally as they moved west, the canopy opening in places, more sky visible, the light different from the deep interior of the old-growth forest, more direct, less filtered. She had a complicated relationship with direct light. 6 years in deep forest had given her eyes calibrated to the dim and the dappled, and direct light now felt like something she needed to adjust to rather than something she simply moved through. That, too, was something she would have to address in the weeks ahead. She thought about the weeks ahead, the practical ones, the things that would need to be done and organized, the conversations she would need to have and the ones she would need to receive. She was a person who managed difficulty better when she had broken it into its component parts and understood what each part required, so she worked through this now while her feet moved, cataloging, assessing, building the beginning of a practical structure around something that was still mostly large and formless. It helped. Thinking about it concretely helped. She was not sure yet where she would live in the settlement. She was not sure yet which conversations she wanted to have first and which ones should wait. She was not sure how to handle the first days, when everything would be new and observed, and she would be visible in ways she had not been visible for a long time. She would figure those things out. She had figured out how to build a cabin alone in the winter. She had figured out how to survive in a forest with no instruction and no resources and no one to ask. She could figure out how to be back among people. She was good at figuring things out. She heard the scouts before she saw them. 2 of them were sitting at the base of a large pine at the western edge of the tree line, where the forest gave way to open ground that she could see ahead through the last of the trees. The third was standing some distance off, watching the approach route. All 3 turned toward her in chaos when they entered hearing range. She looked at the scouts. They looked at her. She recognized the posture of trained people who had been briefed on a situation and were now seeing the situation in person for the first time and were measuring the reality against the briefing. She had done that herself. She understood the look. She met it without flinching. This is Lena, Kaya said, simply without ceremony. The lead scout nodded to her, not deferential, not hostile, just present. Professional. We are ready, he said. She looked past the scouts at the open ground beyond the trees. Not far ahead, maybe half a mile, she could see the beginning of a road, a proper road, the kind with graded surface and clear edges, the kind that led somewhere specific and expected. She had not seen a road like that in 6 years. She stood at the last of the trees and looked at it. "We can rest here if you need a moment," Caius said. She looked at him. "I do not need a moment," she said. She stepped out of the trees. The light hit her differently out here, the full winter light without canopy, and she adjusted to it the way she adjusted to everything now, without excessive reaction, with the calm attention of someone who has learned to process what is actually happening rather than what she expected to happen. Cold, clear, sky in every direction above her rather than patches of it between branches. She breathed it in. She had been in the forest for so long that the open sky felt strange, not frightening exactly, not overwhelming, but large in a way she had forgotten the sky could be. She looked up at it and felt the vastness of it and let herself feel it rather than managing the feeling. The 3 scouts formed up around her and Caius without fuss, the easy positioning of people who had done this many times, and the 5 of them began to move west along the edge of the forest toward the road. She walked. The ground underfoot was different from forest ground, firmer, flatter, less variable. Her boots made a slightly different sound on it. Small thing, she noticed it. She noticed everything. She had trained herself to notice everything because in the forest noticing was survival, and the training did not switch off because the context had changed, and she thought that this was probably, on balance, going to be useful in the life she was walking toward. There would be things to notice in that life too, different things but things. The road was half a mile from the forest edge, and they reached it in 20 minutes. She stopped at the edge of it and looked both ways along its length, west toward wherever it led, east back the direction she had come from, and she thought about the specific irrevocability of standing at the edge of a road, the way a road implied a destination and direction in a way that a forest trail did not. She had not been on a road in 6 years. Caius stopped beside her. "Ready," he said, "not a question exactly, a check." She looked at the road. She thought about the flat rock on the ridge, and the creek in the morning, and the sound of the whetstone, and the particular cold quality of first light through the cabin's single shutter. She held those things, and she let them be what they were, real and gone, and she felt the grief of them clearly, because she had decided not to not feel things anymore when she did not have to. She felt it. Then she looked west. "Yes," she said. She stepped onto the road and walked. The road took them through open country for 2 hours before the first signs of habitation appeared. She had forgotten what habitation looked like from a distance, or not forgotten exactly. She had the memory of it, the visual information, fields and fencing and the smoke of distant fires in the cold air, but the memory had been stored in the part of her mind where old things were kept, and had not been activated in 6 years, and activating it now had a quality of unreality to it, as if she were watching something familiar through glass. She walked and she observed. The scouts maintained their loose formation around her and Caius, not close, not crowding, but present in the way trained people were present, a constant background awareness. She had been the person in that formation once years ago in a different life. She understood the role and the protocol and the way you moved inside it. She understood a great deal about pack operations that she had been carrying unused for 6 years like a language you do not speak but have not lost. She was going to need that knowledge. She thought about what Caius had told her about the current state of the 6 packs, the relationships and the tensions and the particular landscape of authority she was walking back into. She had been good at navigating that landscape once. She had been very good at it, actually. She had not spent 6 years in a forest for nothing, but she had also not spent 6 years in the political environment of pack leadership, and there would be gaps in what she knew, things that had shifted while she was gone, relationships and histories she would need to learn from scratch. She was going to need patience with herself. That was something she was better at now than she had been. 6 years in the forest had given her that, the specific patience of someone who has learned to work at the pace of what is actually possible rather than at the pace of what would be convenient. She thought about all of this and watched the open country pass around her, and the first buildings appeared on the edge of the horizon, dark shapes against the winter sky, solid and specific and real. "How far?" she said. "Another hour," Caius said. She nodded. She had been walking for most of the day, and her pack was at the weight where a pack is most noticeable, not heavy enough to require conscious effort, but present in the particular way that something becomes present when your body has been carrying it long enough to become aware of it. She adjusted her shoulders without stopping. The scouts changed formation slightly at some point in the middle of the last hour, and she noticed it without drawing attention to the noticing. They were now running a slightly tighter configuration, more attentive, which told her they were approaching a point of potential contact, coming into range of people who might be watching the road. She adjusted her own bearing. Not dramatically. Not the kind of thing that anyone who did not know what to look for would have noticed. Just the settling of her shoulders, the slight change in how she held her chin, the subtle adjustment that meant she was prepared to be seen. She had not been seen in a long time, truly seen by people who would recognize her and know what her presence meant. She was going to be seen now. The settlement came into view around a curve in the road, and she looked at it. It was not the same as she remembered. Settlements changed. Buildings were added and modified, the layout shifted over time with the pressures of growth and use, new structures appearing where there had been open ground. She could read the changes the way she read any landscape, by what was there now against the map she carried in her memory, identifying the differences. Larger than before, a new structure on the north side that had not been there. The eastern approach had been improved. Several things she could see from the road that told her time had passed here the way time had passed everywhere while she was in the forest, steadily and without waiting for her. "The people who will see you first," she said. "Do they know I am coming?" "The immediate guard does," Caius said. "Not the general settlement. I did not want to create a situation before I knew there was a situation to create." Sensible, she had expected that from him. He would not have announced her return before he had confirmed she was returning. "How many people know about the investigation?" she said. "The corrected account." "It was formally communicated to the full pack 8 months ago," he said. "There was a gathering. Everyone who was present heard it at the same time." "And the reaction?" "Mixed," he said. "As I told you, some people found it clarifying and it changed things immediately. Others needed more time. A few have been resistant." She thought about resistant. She had experienced resistance before, had worked inside political environments where the default of some people was to entrench against new information if that information required them to change something they had organized their understanding around. It was not comfortable, it was manageable. "I am not going to ask them to immediately feel differently than they do," she said. "I understand that the story was told to them and they believed it, and changing what you believe is not fast, and I am not going to expect it to be." He looked at her. "That is a considered response," he said. "I have had time to think," she said. They were close now. She could see the first of the settlement's buildings in real detail, not just shapes but specific structures, walls and windows, and the organized space of a community that had been building and maintaining itself. She could see people moving between the buildings, small figures at this distance, going about the late afternoon business of a settlement at the end of a day. One of the figures was stationary, at the edge of the settlement nearest the road. A guard post. She watched it and the figure there became more specific as they approached, a young person, not much past training by the look, holding the position with the particular alertness of someone who takes the work seriously. The figure saw them and she watched the recognition move through the figure's posture, the slight change that meant the expected party had been identified. Then the figure saw her. She watched the recognition land differently. The posture adjustment was subtle, but she caught it. This was someone who knew who she was, or knew the name, or had been told something, and the seeing of it in person was a different thing from the knowing of the name. She kept walking. They reached the guard post and the young guard said, "Alpha King confirmed." A pause. Then carefully, "And your companion?" She waited. Caius said, "This is Lena." He used her name, not her title, just her name, giving the guard the minimum for an immediate professional situation and leaving the rest of it for later. The guard nodded and moved to allow them passage. She walked through. She was inside the settlement. The light here was different from the road, the light of a community rather than of open country, the warmth of fires visible in windows and the ambient glow of a place where people lived. She had not been in a place that felt like this in 6 years, and the sensory quality of it was very strong, a depth and complexity of information that the forest, for all its richness, did not provide in the same way. She walked. She noticed the faces that turned toward them. Not everyone. Many people were occupied with their own business and did not immediately register the arrival of a party on the road. But some people looked, and some of those people who looked continued to look, and she could feel the specific quality of being recognized moving through the settlement the way a sound moves, reaching outward from the first person who identified it. She kept her shoulders level, she kept her chin level, she breathed. He was walking beside her, not ahead, not behind, and the positioning of him there was both practical and something else, a specific statement made through physical arrangement without requiring any words. She was aware of it. She was aware of a great deal at once, which was her normal state in any complex environment, the constant multi-tracking that had saved her from more than a few bad situations over the years, and that was now running at full capacity on the information-rich environment of a settlement she had not been in for 6 years. People were noticing. The party moved into the main clearing of the settlement, the central space that she remembered from before, which had changed, and which she was reorganizing in her memory in real time against the map she had stored. A fire in the center, buildings on 3 sides, people going still as the party entered. She looked at the fire. She looked at the people around it. She was not going to look at the ground. She had decided that before she walked through the gate, she was not going to look away. She looked at the faces in the firelight and she counted them, one by one, and she did not look away from any of them, and she felt the weight of all the years compressed into this specific moment, the return of a person who had been gone and was now here, and she stood inside that weight and she did not let it flatten her. He stopped. She stopped beside him. He looked at her, one specific look, a question that was not about this moment but about all the ones that would come after it. She looked back. "I know," she said. He nodded. They stood together in the firelight of the settlement she had returned to, and around them the community continued its process of noticing and adjusting and recalibrating, and she felt the quality of that process without trying to manage or resist it. She was present. She was going to remain present. That was the decision she had made. She was keeping it. The first evening in the settlement was the hardest. Not because anything went wrong, nothing went wrong. There was no confrontation, no difficult encounter, no moment that required her to do anything other than be present and receive what came at her with reasonable composure. The hardest part was simpler than any of that. The hardest part was being among people. She had not understood, not fully, how much 6 years of solitude had changed the experience of company until she was in it. The settlement had approximately 200 people in it. Not all of them were in the central clearing that evening, but enough were, and the sheer volume of human information, the voices and the movement and the weight of being looked at and registered and responded to as a person with history rather than as a feature of the landscape, was more than she had expected to feel. She managed it. She was good at managing things. She remained composed and she spoke when spoken to, and she accepted the brief and professional acknowledgement of the people Caius introduced her to, who did it well, without excess. But inside the composure she was working very hard, and she was glad when the evening ended, and she was given a place to sleep that was quiet and private, and she could close the door and sit in the dark and let her system decompress. She sat in the dark for a long time. It was different dark from the forest dark. The forest dark had weight and dimension, the specific 3-dimensional darkness of a space filled with living things and their particular quality of presence. This dark was flatter. The walls were close. The sounds from outside were human sounds, voices and movement, the evidence of a community existing around her. She listened to it. She had forgotten what community sounded like when you were inside it rather than hiding from it, the texture of it. The way it never fully went quiet, not even late at night, because there were always some people still awake, always some small activity continuing, always the evidence of collective life continuing to run whether any individual member was conscious of it or not. She sat in the dark and she listened to the settlement and she thought, this is real. This is what she had come back to. She had not been fooling herself in the forest about what this was. She had known it was a community and that communities had demands and difficulties and histories and all the things that solitude did not have. She had known that abstractly. She was knowing it concretely now. She lay down. She looked at the ceiling of a room that was not her cabin, that had different proportions and different sounds and different shadows, and she breathed, and she practiced the thing she had been practicing for a week, the thing that was harder than it sounded, staying in the present moment without retreating from it. She stayed. She was awake for a long time. Eventually she slept. In the morning she was up before the settlement fully woke, which was early because she could not sleep past dawn and had not for 6 years, and she went outside into the cold and stood in the clearing by herself for a few minutes in the pre-dawn dark before anyone else appeared. The clearing was different at this hour, quiet, empty, the fire reduced to coals. She stood in it and she breathed the cold air, and she let herself be in it without having to navigate anything. That was what she needed, a few minutes of not navigating. She got them. Then the settlement began to wake, and she turned to face it. The first day was about learning the layout, relearning the spaces and the functions and the current arrangement of things that had changed while she was gone. Caius gave her the tour himself, which she appreciated, not because she needed a guide in the practical sense, but because having him there gave her context for things she was seeing, and because his presence modulated the quality of the attention she was receiving from the people they passed. She was receiving a great deal of attention. She had expected it. She received it with the equanimity she had built up over years of learning to manage her own responses to difficult things, which was not the same as the equanimity she had had before, which had been younger and less tested. This was the harder kind. She met the people who needed to be met. Some of those meetings were comfortable, some were not. There was a woman who looked at her with the specific expression of someone who had believed something for a long time and was now in the process of revising it, and the revision was not comfortable, and the discomfort was visible on her face. Lena held the woman's gaze and did not retreat from it and said what needed to be said simply, and the woman nodded and moved on, and that was that for now. Not all of it was going to be done in one day, she knew that. There was a man who had known Owen well, who looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. That was not hostility but was not warmth either, something more complicated and private that she did not try to decode in the moment but noted and set aside to come back to when there was more context. There were younger people who had joined the pack after she left and who had no personal history with her, only what they had been told, and whose expressions were mostly curious, the open curiosity of people encountering something new and trying to organize it. She was a new thing to them. That was useful to remember. By midday she was tired in a way she had not been tired in a long time, not physically but the specific tiredness of a day spent at high social and cognitive intensity. She had gotten used to the low-intensity days of the forest, the days where nothing demanded of her except what she chose to demand of herself, and this was a different pace. She was going to need to build up to it. She thought about building up to it. She thought about what that looked like, what it required, what she needed to put in place so that she had enough time alone to sustain the time she spent among people. That was a balance she was going to have to negotiate explicitly with Caius and probably with others. She was not going to pretend she could simply flip a switch and go from 6 years of solitude to full integration into community life without any adjustment period. She was going to need to say that. She said it. She found Caius in the afternoon and she told him plainly. She needed time alone each day. She needed it to be understood and respected that she was not going to be immediately available for the full range of social demands of community life, that she was going to need space and quiet, and that this was not withdrawal or avoidance, but simply what she needed to function at the level that was going to be useful to anyone. He listened. Of course, he said, whatever you need, tell me what the right arrangement looks like and we will make it happen. She told him. He listened and he organized what she asked for with the same efficiency she had observed all week, and by the evening she had what she had asked for, which was a room at the edge of the settlement that was quieter than the central area and had access to the outside that did not require going through the main clearing, and a clear understanding from the people around Caius that there were hours each day when she was not available. She stood in her room and looked at the window, which was a real window with glass in it, and she looked out at the edge of the settlement and the open ground beyond it and the distant line of the forest. She could see the forest from here. She had not expected that to matter as much as it did. But it mattered. To know that it was there, still there, that the 6 years of it were still real and available to be seen, that she had not imagined it or left it somewhere inaccessible. It was there. She was here. Both things were true. She pressed her hand against the cold glass. Then she stepped back and sat down, and she thought about the days ahead, the real work of them, the difficult and necessary and sometimes uncomfortable process of becoming someone in a community again after 6 years of being someone entirely to herself. She was ready for it. Not in the way of someone who has no fear of what is coming, because she had fear of what was coming, the specific clear fear of someone who knows what the hard parts are going to be and is walking toward them anyway. In the way of someone who has decided. She had decided. She sat with the forest visible through the window and the settlement audible through the walls, and she sat in the middle of both of those things and breathed. Tomorrow would come with what it brought. She would meet it with what she had. That was enough. That had always been enough. The first week passed in the way that first weeks in new situations always pass, a blur of necessary tasks and mandatory firsts, the accumulation of small navigations that build, without your being entirely aware of it, into the beginning of a routine. She woke early every morning and spent the first hour alone, outside, at the edge of the settlement nearest the open ground. This was not negotiated. It was simply what she did, and she had told Caius she would do it, and he had organized the watch schedule so that the person at the east post in those hours was someone who understood that she was not a security concern and did not need to be followed or checked on. She stood at the edge of the settlement in the pre-dawn dark, and she breathed, and she thought, and she let herself process the previous day before the current day began. It was not so different from the forest in some ways, the form of it, the solitary hour, the attention paid, the deliberate preparation for what was coming. The content was different because the content of her life was different, but the form held, and she was glad for that. On the second morning she was joined, briefly, by a woman named Clara who was in charge of the Eastern Watch, and who appeared at her post, while Lena was standing at the edge of the clearing, and said good morning without stopping and continued on her route without making anything of the encounter. On the third morning Clara said good morning again, and again on the fourth. On the fifth morning Lena said good morning first. Small things, that was how the beginning of anything was built. Small things repeated until they had weight. The days held difficult moments. There was the meeting with the full council, which she had known was coming and had prepared for, which did not make it less difficult but made it possible. She sat at a table with 9 people and presented herself as she was, not the person they remembered and not a performance of the person they had been told about, just the person she was now, which was someone who had lived 6 years in a forest and had come back and was going to require them to deal with her as she actually was rather than as any previous version of her. That went better than she had expected. Not because everyone was welcoming. 2 members of the council were not welcoming, one openly and one in the way that people who are practiced at managing their expressions are not welcoming, the kind of distance that looks like professionalism but has a different temperature. She registered both and did not challenge either, not in that meeting. There would be time for the individual conversations that needed to happen, and the wrong time and the wrong setting would make them harder. There was the meeting with Owen's family, which she had asked for. She had asked Caius to arrange it, and he had, carefully and with the appropriate communication beforehand, and she had gone to the meeting alone. She had made that clear. She went alone, not because she needed to prove she could manage it, but because it needed to be 2 people in a room, not 2 people and an alpha king. Owen's mother was named Helen. She was in her 50s, a contained person, someone who gave the impression of having made a set of decisions about how to inhabit difficulty that she had been maintaining consistently for a long time. She looked at Lena with the look of someone who had already done most of the grieving they were going to do, and was now in the different territory that comes after, the longer and quieter territory of learning to live with the permanent shape of an absence. They sat in a room together, and Lena said what she had come to say, which was not an explanation and was not a defense and was not a performance of guilt. It was a simple and honest acknowledgement of Owen as a person she had thought about for 6 years, and of the years she had spent believing something that was not true, and of what it was like to discover that the truth was different. She said those things plainly, and she did not manage them, she just said them. Helen listened. At the end, Helen said, "I am glad to know what actually happened. The official account was helpful, but it was formal. This is different." Lena nodded. "He would have thought the circumstances were ridiculous," Helen said, not quite smiling. "He had a very low tolerance for people doing complicated things for simple reasons. He would have found the whole situation very typical of the kind of thing he disliked." Lena thought about the 22-year-old, who was funny in a quiet way. "He sounds like someone I would have liked," she said. "Yes," Helen said. "He was." They sat in the room a little while longer, not talking, and then Lena stood and said thank you, and Helen said there was no need for thanks, and they parted, and Lena walked back across the settlement, and she held Owen clearly in her mind for the first time since she had left the forest, without the contamination of false guilt, just clearly, just as a young person who had been present and then not present, and who deserved to be thought of without complexity. She was glad to be able to do that. The second week was different from the first in the way that second weeks are different. The novelty had worn off. The adrenaline that had been carrying her through the first wave of difficult things had settled to its ordinary level, and what remained was the daily work of being in a place among people with a complicated history. The daily work was real work, not dramatic, not the kind of thing that would make a story, just the persistent effort of showing up and being present and doing what needed to be done. She helped with things, not because she was trying to prove something, and not because she was performing the role of someone who wanted to be useful, but because usefulness was how she was built, and she had things to offer, and the offering of them was what she knew how to do. She offered them as plainly as she offered everything. "Here is what I can do, tell me what is needed." She was given things to do. She did them. The woman on the council who had been openly cool toward her in the first meeting was named Ruth, and she was in charge of the pack's supply and logistics, which was one of the most genuinely demanding roles in the settlement, requiring constant attention and very good judgment, and the ability to work with a great variety of people, with a great variety of approaches. Lena understood supply and logistics from her years in the forest, the deep practical understanding of what was needed, and when and what happened when you miscalculated. She went to Ruth with a specific question about a specific supply problem she had noticed in her first week, a question framed not as criticism, but as genuine inquiry, the kind of question that only makes sense if you already understand the system well enough to see the problem. Ruth looked at her. She answered the question. They spent 2 hours working through the supply problem together. They did not become friendly. That was not the point and was not what happened. But something changed in the quality of Ruth's attention, the specific change that happens when a person who has been skeptical encounters competence in a direct and unambiguous way and finds that their skepticism needs to be recalibrated. Ruth recalibrated. That was enough for now. Caius was present in her days in the way she was learning to characterize his presence, consistently, without crowding. He was available but not intrusive. He checked in without appearing to check in. He knew what was happening in the settlement without appearing to be watching for it, which was a quality of leadership she had always respected because she understood how much attention it required and how easy it would be to make it look like surveillance rather than care. They had one real conversation in the second week that was not about the settlement or the practical situation. It happened in the evening, in the smaller room off the main hall where he did most of the work that did not require the presence of others, and she had come to tell him something about the supply situation with Ruth, and they had addressed that, and then the conversation had become something else. "How are you sleeping?" he said. It was a simple question. "Better than the first week," she said. "The sounds are different, I'm adjusting." He nodded. "The meeting with Helen," he said, "not a question, just an acknowledgement." "It was important," she said. "I am glad I went." "Yes," he said. She looked at him across the table. "I want to ask you something," she said. He waited. "When you decided to come yourself," she said. "You said it was because I would have run from a formal approach. That is true, but I want to know if there was something else." He held her gaze. "I told you already," he said. "I needed to see you." "Yes," she said. "I know, but I want to know what you meant by that." A pause, the kind of pause that meant the question had landed in the right place. "I meant," he said, "that I have been carrying the knowledge of what happened to you for 2 years, and the looking for you for 4 years before that, and at some point the carrying of it becomes something different from administrative concern. At some point it becomes personal in a way that does not fit inside any professional category. She looked at the table. She let that sit. "I am not asking you to respond to that," he said. "I am telling you because you asked and you deserve the truth. I am not expecting anything from it." She looked up at him. "I know," she said. "But," she said. She stopped. "But," he said. She looked at him. "I have been thinking," she said carefully, "about what this is, what being here is. And I do not want to confuse coming back to the pack with coming back to a relationship that I do not know yet if we still have, or if we ever had in the way I thought we did, or what it would look like now if we did. I want to be careful about that." "That is very sensible," he said. "I am not saying no to anything," she said. "I know," he said. "I am saying I need time." "I know," he said. "Take it." She looked at him. The quality of his patience was extraordinary. She had been observing it all week, and she was observing it now, the specific quality of someone who has decided to wait, and is doing so not because they have no choice, but because they have made the choice. "You are very patient," she said. "I have been looking for you for 4 years," he said. "A little more time is not a hardship." She was quiet. "All right," she said. She stood up. "I will let you know when I have figured out what I want to say," she said. "I will be here," he said. She went back to her room. She stood at the window, and she looked at the dark line of the forest, visible even at night by the density of it against the lighter sky. She thought about patience. She thought about the 6 years and the 4 years and the 2 years, all the time that had accumulated around this situation, and she thought about what it meant that she was here now, in this room, in this settlement, having had that conversation. She had spent 6 years not being ready for things. She was not done being not ready. She would not be done for a while. But she was here. And that was the difference. The 3rd week was when the difficult things started to look different. Not resolved, she was not naive about what resolved meant or how long it actually took, but different. The way a landscape looks different after you have been walking through it for a while, when the features you saw first have settled into their actual relative importance, and the things you did not notice initially have become visible. She had a long conversation with the 2 council members who were still skeptical of her, not together but separately, and both conversations were hard and neither of them ended in the place she had hoped they might end, but both of them moved. That was what she could say about them. They moved, from one place to another. Not a finished place, not a comfortable place, but different from where they started, and different meant movement was possible, and movement meant eventually something else was possible. She was learning, or remembering, the pace of this kind of work. It was slower than she wanted it to be. It always had been. She had not been a patient person before the forest, and the forest had made her patient, not by making things easy, but by making things take as long as they needed to take regardless of what she wanted. The forest did not hurry for anyone. She had learned to move at the pace of reality rather than the pace she preferred. She was using that now. She helped with the supply situation, the one she had identified in the first week and raised with Ruth. The problem was real, and the fix required coordination between 3 different parts of the settlement that did not typically work together, and she organized that coordination in the practical and unhurried way she organized things, and within the week the problem was addressed. Ruth said when it was done that the approach she had taken was a good one. Lena said thank you. That was it, that was the whole conversation. But the quality of it was different from the quality of the earlier conversation with Ruth in the first week, and the difference was not nothing. She was in the middle of the 3rd week when something shifted in the way people looked at her. She noticed it the way she noticed everything in layers, first as a vague sense that the texture of the attention she was receiving was different, and then as a more specific observation of particular behaviors that confirmed the sense. People who had been looking at her sideways in the first 2 weeks were looking at her more directly now. People who had been professional but contained were showing the loosening that came with familiarity, the way the careful becomes casual when someone has been around long enough to be ordinary. She was becoming ordinary. She had been conspicuous for 2 weeks, the returned person, the complicated history, the significant arrival that everyone had opinions about. And the opinions were still there. She did not imagine they had gone away, but the acute conspicuousness was fading as the days accumulated, and she was simply there, doing things, talking to people, existing in the settlement with the quiet competence she brought to existing anywhere. She was becoming part of the background. She had not expected that to feel as good as it felt. She ran into the young guard, the one who had been at the East Post on the first morning and had said good morning and continued on without making anything of it. She ran into him in the late afternoon in the area near the storage buildings, where she had been working with the supply team, and he looked at her with the open, uncomplicated look of someone who had never had a complicated story about her to recalibrate from, just a person who was here and worked and said good morning. "The new storage arrangement is better," he said, meaning the changes she had helped implement. "Yes," she said. "The winter supplies will be easier to reach," he said. "That was the point," she said. He nodded and went on his way, and she stood in the path for a moment after he left and felt, for a moment, the specific quiet pleasure of an exchange that was entirely without weight. She went back to work. In the evening she went to the edge of the settlement and stood in her usual spot and looked at the forest. The forest looked the same as it always looked from here, dark and large and patient, the same patient quality it had had when she was inside it, the quality of something that does not require anything from you and will be there regardless of what you decide. She was glad it was still there. She thought about the cabin, sealed and banked, waiting in the deep interior for no one. She thought about the snare lines, untended now, the wire settling into the undergrowth. She thought about the flat rock above the creek, the rock she had used for thinking, and she thought about sitting on it in the mornings with the water below her and the cold air on her face. She did not wish she were back there. She noticed that without making a thing of it, filed it as information. She did not wish she were back there. The place was real and it mattered and she would carry it, but she did not wish she were there instead of here. That was something. She went inside. She sat in her room with the lamp on and she thought about what Caius had said in the second week, the thing about carrying knowledge and it becoming personal. She had been thinking about it at the edges of other things all week, not looking at it directly, letting it be peripheral until she had the space to look at it properly. She had the space now. She looked at it. She thought about what she wanted. Not what was complicated, not what had history, not what was difficult and would require navigation and time. Just what she wanted, in the simple and uncomplicated way that you want things when you stop qualifying wanting with all the reasons it might be complicated. She knew what she wanted. She had known it for most of the week. She was not going to pretend she did not know, because pretending not to know something you know was a habit she had been working to break for a while and was not going to indulge now. She knew. The question was not what she wanted, the question was whether she was ready. And she thought about readiness. She thought about the 6 years of not being ready and the week of being present despite not being ready and the conversation in the second week where she had said I need time and he had said take it. And she thought about what it meant that the time kept passing and she kept not feeling ready and she kept doing things anyway. She had been doing things she was not ready for 3 weeks. Maybe readiness was not a state you arrived at before you moved. Maybe readiness was what you found after you had already moved. She sat with that for a long time. Then she put out the lamp. She lay in the dark and she looked at the ceiling and she thought about the forest and the cabin and the 6 years, and the flat rock and the knife she had sharpened every morning, and the fire she had kept low, and the trails she had never repeated. She thought about all of that. And then she thought about the settlement, and the morning hour at the edge of the clearing and Clara's good morning, and the supply problem with Ruth and the young guard who did not have a complicated story about her. She thought about Helen and Owen and what it meant to grieve someone clearly, without contamination. She thought about Caius and the patience and the 4 years and the bread on the stone. And she thought about what she had said to herself on the first night of trying to decide, I have been not ready for 6 years, and the difference between not ready and not willing. She had been not willing. She was willing now. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would do what the previous 3 weeks had been building toward. Not because she was ready. Because she was willing, and willing was what she had, and willing was enough to start. She had learned that in the forest too, in the end. The forest did not wait for you to be ready. It required you to act with the resources you had, not the resources you wished you had, and you became ready through the acting, not before it. She was going to act. Tomorrow. She slept. She found him in the morning. Not in the formal room, and not in the main hall, and not at the council table. She found him where she had started finding him at the beginning of the day, in the outdoor space near the north side of the settlement where he went in the early hours to think, which she had learned by observing pattern, which was something she was good at. He was standing at the edge of the cleared ground looking north, in the direction of the open country, in the direction that far enough out would eventually reach the old-growth forest and the ridge and the particular territory she had lived in for 6 years. She came and stood beside him. He turned to look at her. She looked north. "I have been thinking," she said. "I know," he said. "About what I want," she said. He was quiet. "I told you in the second week that I needed time," she said. "And I did need time. I still need time in the sense that there is a great deal ahead of me here that is going to take time, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But I have been confusing two different kinds of needing time, and I think I need to stop doing that." He waited. "One kind is the practical kind," she said. "The time to do the work that needs to be done, the council members and the community and the reputation that needs to be rebuilt and all of that. That is real, and it is going to take as long as it takes." "Yes," he said. "The other kind," she said, "is the kind where I keep waiting to feel ready for something that I have already decided I want, and I keep calling that needing time when what it actually is being afraid." She looked at him. He was looking at her with the full quality of his attention, that particular quality she had spent a week trying to get used to, the kind of attention that did not flinch or qualify but also did not demand or press. "I have been afraid," she said. "That is the truth of it. Not of you, not of anything specific, just afraid in the general way that a person is afraid when they have been very hurt and have spent a long time making themselves safe from further hurting, and then something comes along that requires them to be unsafe again." "Yes," he said. "I am still afraid," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I am not going to wake up and not be afraid of this." "I know," he said. "But," she said. She looked at him. "I spent 6 years waiting to be ready," she said. "And the not readiness was real, some of it, but some of it was also just fear wearing the clothes of not readiness, and I am not going to keep letting them wear each other's clothes." He was very still. "What I am saying," she said, "is that I know what I want and I am choosing it even though I am afraid of it, because the alternative is more 6 years of forest, and I have already had 6 years of forest, and I do not want 6 more." He looked at her. "What do you want?" he said, not because he did not know, because he was giving her the full weight of saying it. She held his gaze. "I want this," she said, "the settlement and the work and the complicated history and all of it, and I want to do it alongside you rather than adjacent to you. I want the thing that was between us before to have a chance to become whatever it is now, with the people we are now rather than with the people we were. I want to stop treating it as a separate question from the question of whether I am here." He said nothing. She kept looking at him. "I am not asking you to tell me it will be easy," she said. "I know it will not be easy. I am not asking for reassurance, and I am not asking you to pretend the history is not what it is. I am asking for the chance to find out what this is when it is not running on a wrong story and a 6-year absence." He reached out and he did something she had not expected. He placed his hand over hers, not holding, just resting, the specific contact of someone being careful about what they are saying with a gesture. "Yes," he said. "Simple, no excess." She looked down at his hand and then back up at his face, and she let herself feel the weight of the moment, the specific weight of a thing she had been carrying for 6 years resolving into something different, not lighter necessarily, not simpler, but different. She was glad to feel it clearly. "All right," she said. She turned back north. The open country was gray and cold in the early morning, frost still visible on the ground, the kind of morning that would warm later but was fully winter at this hour. She breathed the cold air and she thought about all the mornings she had breathed cold air alone, and she thought about this morning, this cold air, this person standing beside her. She preferred this. She would be honest about that, the same way she had been honest about everything else. She preferred this. "There is a meeting with the full council at midday," he said. "I know," she said. "I am prepared for it." "And the situation with the eastern boundary that Ruth raised yesterday," he said. "I am going to look at it this morning," she said, "before the meeting." He nodded. They stood in the cold morning and the settlement began to wake around them, the sounds of it, the voices and the movement, and the evidence of 200 lives continuing their ordinary business. She listened to it. She had been listening to it for 3 weeks and she was still learning its rhythms, the patterns of it, which sounds meant what at which hours, the way the morning sounded different from the afternoon, the specific quality of the settlement at this hour before it fully opened into the day. She was going to keep listening. She was going to learn it the way she had learned the forest, which was by being in it, consistently over time with attention. She was good at that. "I am going to need more time with some things," she said. "I want to be clear about that. The council members who are still resistant, the people who have complicated feelings, the work of building back what was damaged, all of that is going to take time and I am not going to rush it or pretend it can be rushed." "I know," he said. "And I am going to need you to let me do some of it myself," she said. "I am not looking for someone to manage the difficult parts. I am capable of managing the difficult parts." "I know," he said again. "You say that very easily," she said. "Because it is true," he said. She looked at him. "You have been very careful all week not to handle things on my behalf," she said. "I noticed." "I thought you would," he said. She turned back to look at the open country. She thought about the word handle, about the specific care of someone who could have smoothed things over, could have intervened in the difficult conversations and the skeptical looks and the slow work of Ruth and the council and Owen's mother, and who had not, who had been present and available, and had kept his own involvement in the background. She had noticed. She had been noticing things about him all week with the particular attention of someone who is still making up their mind, taking inventory, building the picture piece by piece. And the picture that had been building was consistent in the ways that mattered. He was the person he appeared to be. She had learned to be cautious about that, to not assume that appearance was reality, to wait for the evidence. The evidence was accumulating. She believed it. She was going to act on it. She said, "I am going to go and look at the eastern boundary situation before the midday meeting." "Yes," he said. "I will see you at the meeting," she said. She turned to go. "Lena," he said. She looked back. He looked at her with that expression she had been categorizing all week and had not yet found the right word for, the one that was quieter than relief and more specific than warmth. "I am glad you came back," he said. She held his gaze. "So am I," she said. And she meant it, straightforwardly and without qualification, without the shadow of the hard things that were still there, because the hard things being there did not prevent the straightforward thing from also being true. She was glad. She turned and walked across the clearing toward the eastern edge of the settlement, where Ruth had identified a problem in the boundary marking that was going to require attention, and the settlement moved around her the way it was beginning to move around her, as a person it was used to having there, as someone who was present and working and known. Not fully known yet, that would take more time than 3 weeks. But known. She had a meeting to get to, and a boundary problem to understand and a council to sit with, and all the work of the afternoon and the evening and the next day, and the day after, and all the days ahead of her in this place she had come back to. She walked. The cold air was sharp in her lungs and the settlement was waking around her and the forest was visible on the horizon at the edge of the open ground. And she was here, in this and not in that, present in the life she had chosen to come back to, and choosing it again with each step she took toward the eastern boundary. She was not afraid. She was afraid, she was going to be afraid for a while. But she was also here and choosing to be here, and finding that the choosing got incrementally easier the more she did it, as things do, as hard things always do when you stop saving them for later and simply do them in the present, with the resources you actually have, one morning and one meeting and one difficult conversation at a time. She reached the eastern edge. She looked at the boundary markers. She assessed the problem. She got to work. Outside, behind her, the settlement continued its morning. The fire in the central clearing was being built up for the day. voices carried in the cold air, the smell of food from the main hall, real food, food prepared in quantity for a community rather than for a single person. She had not eaten with a community in 6 years. She was eating with them now. Every meal. Each one a small thing, and also she was discovering, not a small thing at all. She stood at the eastern edge of the settlement, and she looked at the boundary markers, and she thought about small things and what they accumulated into over time, and she thought about 6 years of small things accumulating into the person she was now, and she thought about the small things ahead of her that would accumulate into whoever came next. She was interested in whoever came next. She had not been interested in the future in a long time, not in the concrete and specific way that interest in the future feels when you have actually committed to it. She had been interested in the next day, the next season, the next winter, and what it would require, not the future, not the years. She was interested in the years now. That was new. She let herself feel that it was new without immediately moving past it. She stood at the edge of the settlement, and she let herself feel the specific quality of being interested in her own future, which was something she had not allowed herself for a very long time, which felt like standing in a room with more space in it than she had been used to, and taking a moment before she began to fill it. The moment passed. She turned her full attention to the boundary markers. She was going to solve this problem, and then she was going to go to the midday meeting, and then she was going to do what came after that, and after that, and after that, in the way that a person who has decided to be somewhere continues to be there, not dramatically, not with constant commentary on the significance of being there, just there. Just present. Just staying. That was the whole of it. She stayed. She worked through the morning. The eastern boundary problem was more involved than the initial description had suggested, which was usually how things turned out when you actually examined them, rather than relying on someone else's summary. There were 3 markers that had shifted over the winter, not dramatically, not in a way that changed the functional boundary, but in a way that would matter over time if it was not corrected now. The kind of small deviation that, left alone, became a large disagreement somewhere down the line. She mapped the markers against the existing record, which was kept in the administration building, and which she had gone to retrieve before coming out here, because approaching a problem without its documentation was a habit she refused to maintain even in situations that felt like they should be simple. The documentation was not consistent with the physical situation in 2 places. She stood in the cold with the papers in her hands and looked at the discrepancy and thought about what it meant and what needed to happen to address it. Then she went to find Ruth. Ruth was in the storage area when she found her, supervising a rotation of winter supplies that had been going on for 2 days. She was focused and efficient, and she looked at Lena with the expression that had replaced the earlier skepticism, the more neutral and professionally respectful expression that had been building through the supply project of the previous week. The eastern boundary, Lena said. There are inconsistencies in the documentation that are going to need to be resolved before the physical markers are reset, or the resetting will be incorrect. Ruth looked at her. The records from 6 years ago, Lena said. Before I left, the boundary documentation from that period. I need to know if those records are still in the administration files or if they have been revised. Ruth thought about this for a moment. They should still be there, she said. We have a policy of retaining originals even when records are updated. Good, Lena said. Then I need to compare the original records with the current ones and determine where the discrepancy originated. Once I know that, I will know how to resolve it. Ruth nodded once. I will send someone to pull the archive files, she said. Thank you, Lena said. She went back to the boundary and continued her assessment while she waited for the archive files, making notes on the current physical state so she would have a complete picture when the documentation arrived. This was the kind of work she had always been good at, the methodical, patient work of finding where things had gone wrong and tracing it back to its source and fixing it properly rather than patching it in a way that would need to be fixed again. She had done this work in a different form in the forest for 6 years, the constant maintenance of a life built in a place that was not designed for habitation, the work of finding and fixing small problems before they became large ones. Same instinct, different context. She was going to be useful here. She had been fairly confident of that before she came back, and 3 weeks in the confidence had increased rather than decreased, which was reassuring in the way that confirmed hypotheses were always reassuring. The archive files arrived with a young person she recognized from the supply project, who handed them over without ceremony and went back to wherever they had come from. She sat down on a stone at the edge of the boundary ground and opened them. She found the discrepancy in 20 minutes. 6 years ago, during the period of reorganization that had followed her departure, someone had made a change to the boundary record that was partially correct and partially in error. The specific kind of error that came from someone doing careful work in a hurry, getting most of it right and making one small mistake that was not obviously wrong until you laid it against the physical reality. She looked at the error. She thought about it. She thought about the fact that the 6-year-old error was in the records from the period right after she left, the period of reorganization and adjustment, and the settlement dealing with a significant disruption to its normal operation. She was not surprised by the error. She was not going to make it into something it was not. It was an error made during a difficult time by someone doing their best under conditions that were not ideal. She corrected it on paper. She noted the correction and the reason for it in the margin. In the clear and specific way she noted things she needed other people to be able to follow. Then she went back to the physical markers, and she worked through the adjustments, methodically and carefully, making each change against the corrected record. It took the rest of the morning. She finished 20 minutes before the midday meeting. She was walking back across the settlement toward the main hall when she passed Caius going the same direction, and they fell into step together without comment, the way people fall into step when they are going to the same place and have gotten comfortable enough with each other's company that the falling into step happens without either of them deciding to do it. She noticed this. She filed it in the category of small things. The small things were where she was learning to pay attention now. The large things were obvious. The large things announced themselves and required response. The small things were quieter and more cumulative, and in her experience were often more informative about what was actually happening. The boundary situation, he said. Resolved, she said. There was an error in the records from 6 years ago. I corrected it and reset the markers. He looked at her. That quickly, he said. It was a straightforward error once I found it, she said. The finding took most of the morning, the fixing was fast. He nodded. Is it documented, he said. Of course, she said. He almost smiled. She noted that too. They went into the main hall and she took her position at the council table, which she had been taking for 2 weeks now without it feeling strange anymore. The specific adjustment of a position that had been yours before and was yours again, her body remembering the room and the table and the angle of the chair before her mind had finished calculating whether it was comfortable. The council meeting covered 6 items. She spoke to 3 of them, with the particular economy she was developing for council speech, which was different from conversation, more precise and more compressed, the language of people who had limited time to address a large volume of things and had learned to make every sentence do more than one job. She was good at council speech. She had been good at it before. She was better now, she thought, in the specific way that 6 years of saying only what was necessary to yourself in the quiet of a forest made you very aware of what was necessary and what was not. The council members who were still in the process of recalibrating their assessment of her listened to her differently than they had in the first week. She was not going to overstate it. They had not arrived at warmth. But they were listening. That was enough for now. The meeting ended in the late afternoon, and she stood outside the main hall in the pale winter light, and she breathed for a moment, the outdoor breathing she did between demanding interior situations, the outdoor breathing she would probably be doing for the rest of her life as one of the essential things she needed. Ruth came out and stood beside her for a moment. The boundary correction, Ruth said. Did you also note the secondary effect on the northern supply route? She had noted it. Yes, she said. I mentioned it at the end of the correction documentation. The route will need to be revised before the spring transit. Ruth nodded. When you have time, Ruth said, I would like to go over the spring transit plan with you. Before it is finalized. Lena looked at her. This was not a small thing dressed as a small thing. This was a real thing. Ruth asking her to be part of the planning of something important was Ruth deciding that her judgment was worth including before a decision was made rather than after it. Yes, Lena said, whenever you want. Ruth nodded and went back inside. Lena stood in the pale light. She stood there for a while, not thinking about anything specifically, just being in the afternoon in the settlement with the sound of it around her and the cold air on her face. And she thought about the morning and the boundary markers and the council meeting and Ruth, and she thought about 3 weeks of small things adding up. She was beginning to have a history here. Not the old history. Not the history she had left and had come back to find partially revised and partially intact and entirely complicated. But new history, the accumulating evidence of days spent in a place doing the work of being there. That was the work. That was what she had understood somewhere in the forest in the time of deciding. The work of being somewhere was not a single choice made once and complete. It was made again every day in the small decisions, in the showing up, in the morning hour and the supply problem and the council seat and the willingness to say yes whenever you want. She was making it. Every day. She turned and walked back across the settlement, not toward any specific next task, just through the early evening of it, the hour when the day's formal work was finishing and the lighter work of the evening was beginning, the sounds changing, the light changing, the smell of cooking from the main hall. She was going to eat with the community tonight. She did that every night now, had been doing it since the first week, had made herself do it even in the first days when the density of human presence had been almost more than she could manage, because the doing of it was how she was going to get to the place where it was no longer almost more than she could manage. She had been right about that. 3 weeks in, eating with 200 people in the main hall at the long tables was a practice she had built, not a thing she was still working up to. Small things done consistently, becoming ordinary. She sat down at the table. The food was warm, the room was warm. The voices around her were the voices of people she was beginning to know, not all of them, not most of them, but more of them each day, and the knowing was incremental and real and hers. She ate. After the meal, she went to her room, and she stood at the window, and she looked north at the dark line of the forest in the last of the light. She stood there for a long time. Then she said quietly to the window and the darkness and the forest that was still there and would remain there, the thing she had been working toward and had arrived at, not dramatically, not in a single moment, but across 3 weeks of ordinary days. She was home. Not the same home she had left, not the home she had been before she left, something that was not the forest and not what was here before but what was here now, which was the settlement and the work and the people and the complicated history and Caius and Ruth and Clara and Helen and the young guard who said good morning and all of it, imperfect and real and hers. She stepped back from the window. She was tired and the morning would come early, and there was a great deal of work between here and the spring that she was going to be part of. She lay down. She closed her eyes. She stayed.